The kitchen light in the evening always had a jaundiced, yellow cast. It flickered twice every time the old compressor in the Sears refrigerator kicked on, a low, shuddering hum that vibrated through the cracked linoleum floor. Clara stood by the sink, her hands submerged in lukewarm, soapy water. The grease from the pork chops was stubborn, clinging to the cheap aluminum pan like a thin, cold skin. She didn't use the sponge immediately. Instead, she let her thumbs trace the worn rim of the pan, measuring the exact amount of pressure needed to scrape away the residue without scratching the metal. From the living room, the rhythmic, metallic ticking of the grandfather clock competed with the drone of a television game show. Thomas, her father, sat in his brown vinyl recliner, his ankles swollen beneath his thick wool socks. The air in the hallway carried the heavy, medicinal scent of camphor and wintergreen, the rub he used 3 times a day for his joints. "Helen," Thomas called out, his voice raspy and thin. "Did the mail come? The flyer said the blood pressure pills should have a coupon this week." Helen, Clara's mother, didn't look up from the dining table. She was meticulously folding circulars, her fingers moving with a practiced, slow rhythm. Her gaze remained fixed on the screen of her cracked smartphone, her thumbs scrolling through social media posts with a dull, repetitive swipe. "Clara picked them up," Helen said, her voice dropping into that familiar flat register she used when she wanted to deflect attention. "She went to the pharmacy after her shift." Clara kept her back to them. She did not point out that the pharmacy trip had taken an extra 40 minutes after her 9-hour day at the clinic registrar's office. She did not mention that the coupon had expired 3 days ago, or that she had paid the $24 difference out of her own purse. To explain would require words, and words required energy she did not possess. Instead, she rinsed the pan. The tap water was cold, smelling faintly of rust and old pipes. "Did you get the brand name?" Thomas's voice drifted in again, slightly louder over the television's applause. "The generic ones make my stomach sour. I told you that last month, Clara." "They didn't have the brand name in stock, Dad," Clara said, her voice quiet, barely carrying past the kitchen threshold. "You should have tried the Plaza Pharmacy," Helen murmured, not looking up from her phone. Her thumb flicked upward on the screen. "It's only 10 minutes further. Julian says the service there is much better anyway. He says they actually respect their customers." At the mention of her brother's name, the air in the room seemed to settle into a heavier, denser state. Clara dried her hands on the damp dish towel hanging from the oven handle. The fabric was frayed at the edges, the printed pattern of faded blue roosters nearly washed away. She reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out her small, leather-bound notebook. It was her ledger. In it, she recorded every expense with a microfine blue pen. The mortgage contribution, the electric bill, the pharmacy receipts, the groceries. Her monthly take-home pay was $3,200. The household expenses she covered totaled $2,400. The remaining $800 was systematically divided. $400 into her primary checking for daily transit and lunches, and $400 into her high-yield savings account, the private fund she kept at a separate bank downtown, the one her parents believed she had closed 2 years ago. She looked at the numbers. The margin was thin, a delicate wire she walked every single day. "Julian needs the car tomorrow," Helen said suddenly. The folding of the circulars had stopped. She was still staring at her phone, her thumb hovering. "He has that meeting in the city, the one with the logistics firm." "I have the early shift," Clara said. Her voice remained even, devoid of inflection. "The buses don't run to the industrial park before 7. "He can't take the bus, Clara," Helen said. She finally looked up, her eyes wide, carrying that soft, wounded look she wore whenever Julian's comfort was questioned. "He has to look presentable. You know how important first impressions are. He's been so stressed lately. He didn't even sleep last night." From the ceiling above, the muffled, heavy thud of footsteps vibrated through the plaster. Julian was awake. The floorboards creaked as he moved from his bed to his desk, followed by the faint, rhythmic clicking of his computer mouse. He had been preparing for various ventures for 18 months, rarely leaving his room before noon, his meals brought up to him on a plastic tray Helen carefully prepared. Clara looked at her mother. Helen's eyes held no malice, only a deep, unshakable conviction that this was the natural order of things. To Helen, Clara's convenience was a utility, like the gas line or the water meter. It was simply expected to flow without interruption. "The bus takes 50 minutes, Clara said. "Then you should leave 50 minutes earlier," Helen replied softly, already turning her attention back to her screen. "It's good for you to walk in the mornings anyway, the fresh air." Clara did not argue. She calculated the physical toll, waking at 5:15 instead of 6, the damp chill of the November mist on her collar, the extra wear on her only pair of sensible work shoes. "Fine," Clara said. She walked out of the kitchen, past the living room where her father was now snoring softly, his chin tucked into his chest. On the wall beside his chair hung the family portrait from 12 years ago. Julian stood in the center, taller than the rest, wearing a dark suit they had bought on credit for a graduation he never completed. Clara was off to the side, her face slightly out of focus, caught in a half-blink that the photographer hadn't bothered to correct. She climbed the narrow wooden stairs, avoiding the third step from the top because it groaned under any weight over 100 pounds. Her bedroom was at the very end of the hall, the smallest room in the house, situated directly over the drafty garage. It was cold inside. She didn't turn on the overhead light. Instead, she switched on the small brass desk lamp. She sat on the edge of her mattress, her knees touching the cheap pine veneer of her desk. She reached down to the bottom drawer, behind the stack of old tax returns, where she kept her private documents. She pulled out the manila envelope containing her bank statements. She liked the physical paper. In a world where her labor was invisible, the printed numbers on the page were proof that she existed, that she was building a wall, brick by brick, between herself and this house. She pulled the statement for her secondary savings account from the envelope. As she did, her fingers registered a microscopic resistance. The adhesive flap of the envelope, which she always sealed with a tiny, precise dab of glue from a stick she kept in her drawer, gave way too easily. It didn't tear. It slid open. Clara held the envelope up to the light of the brass lamp. The edge of the paper inside was slightly crumpled, as if it had been pulled out in a hurry and stuffed back in without care. She took out the statement for the month of October. The balance at the bottom of the page should have read $9,412. Clara looked at the column of transactions. Her eyes did not widen. Her breathing did not change. She simply sat in the cold room, the ticking of the clock downstairs vibrating through the floorboards, while her mind processed the printed line near the bottom of the sheet. October 24th. Withdrawal, branch teller, $5,000. Beneath it, the remaining balance stood at $4,412. She did not have a debit card for this account. She had never authorized a withdrawal. But she knew, with a quiet, icy certainty, who had the spare key to her room, and whose signature could pass for hers in a dimly lit suburban branch where the tellers were too tired to check the signature card. She sat very still for a long time, the paper resting in her palm. From upstairs, the heavy thuds of Julian's footsteps sounded again, followed by the faint, tinny sound of him laughing at something on his computer screen. The draft from the garage crept up through the floorboards of Clara's bedroom, settling in the corners like a physical presence. She lay on her back under the thin quilt, her eyes fixed on the faint, watery reflection of a street lamp on her ceiling. She did not sleep. Instead, she timed her breathing to the slow, heavy thrum of the house. At 5:15 a.m., the silent vibration of her phone against her palm broke the quiet. She swiped it off before the second pulse could echo against the wooden nightstand. She dressed in the dark. Her movements were precise, quiet, and entirely devoid of wasted energy. She slipped on her gray trousers, her thickest socks, and the knitted cardigan with the slightly stretched cuffs. She did not turn on the overhead light. In the dimness, she carefully slid the bank statement back into the manila envelope, aligning the torn edges of the paper exactly as she had found them. She placed it back in the bottom drawer, smoothing the dust on the old tax documents to ensure no trace of her intrusion remained. The hallway was cold, smelling of stale grease and the faint, sweet scent of the vanilla air freshener Helen kept plugged into the outlet near the bathroom. Downstairs, the kitchen was pitch black. Clara did not flip the main switch. The fluorescent bulb was old and buzzed loudly for several seconds before catching, a sound that would inevitably draw Helen's attention. Instead, Clara used the blue light of the microwave display to guide her. She filled a small metal pot with tap water and set it on the stove. The burner sparked 3 times, a dry, clicking sound, before the pale blue flame caught. While the water heated, she took her lunch container from the refrigerator. Inside was a single, portioned block of sharp cheddar cheese, 3 crackers, and a hard-boiled egg she had prepared 2 days ago. It was a sterile, functional meal, designed only to sustain her through a 9-hour shift. "You're up early." Helen's voice came from the darkness of the dining room. She was wearing her oversized, floral fleece robe, the hem dragging slightly on the linoleum. She hadn't brushed her hair, and her eyes were small and swollen with sleep. She did not look at Clara. Her gaze was fixed on the set of car keys hanging from the brass hook beside the pantry. "I have to catch the 5:50 bus," Clara said. Her voice was flat, keeping the pitch low so it wouldn't carry up the stairs to Julian's room. Helen walked over to the stove, her slippers scuffing against the floor. She picked up the kettle, checking its weight to see if there was enough water for her own tea later, before setting it down with a sharp clink. "Julian's meeting is at 9, Helen said, her hand reaching out to claim the car keys from the hook. She gripped them tightly, the metal jingling in her palm. "He's very nervous about the drive. He says the transmission feels sluggish. Did you notice anything when you drove it on Monday?" "The transmission is fine," Clara said, watching the water in her pot begin to simmer, tiny bubbles clinging to the metal sides. "The fluid was replaced last month." "Well, he's sensitive to these things," Helen murmured. She leaned against the counter, her eyes darting toward the hallway stairs before returning to the keys. "He has an ear for machinery. He says if the car breaks down on the highway, it could ruin everything. This logistics firm, it's a very big deal, Clara. If he gets this contract, he'll be able to help us with the mortgage, truly help us." Clara watched a single bubble break the surface of the boiling water. Help us. For 5 years, Julian had been on the verge of truly helping. Every 3 months, a new venture materialized, a shipping partnership, a drop-shipping hustle, a digital currency investment group. Each one required an upfront injection of capital to get started. Each time, the household budget was squeezed until it bled. And each time, the venture dissolved into silence, with Julian retreating to his room for weeks, claiming he had been betrayed by partners who couldn't match his vision. "The bus is $6, Clara said quietly. Helen blinked, her expression shifting into a mask of polite confusion. What? The bus fare, Clara repeated. It's $6 each way, $12 a day. If Julian is using the car for the next 3 days, that's $36. Helen sighed, a soft, weary sound that managed to convey an immense amount of maternal disappointment. She adjusted the collar of her robe. Clara, please, let's not start the day like this. It's family. We all have to make small sacrifices. Julian is trying so hard to get back on his feet. Surely you can see that $36 is a small price to pay for your brother's future. Clara looked at her mother's hands. Helen's fingers were short, her nails cut blunt. She was still holding the car keys, her knuckles slightly white. I'll need the $36 from the grocery jar, Clara said. The jar is empty, Helen said quickly, her voice dropping into a defensive whisper. I had to buy Thomas's ointment yesterday, and the butcher. You know how much Julian needs the proper protein if he's going to be working these long hours. There's nothing left in the jar until Friday. Clara turned off the burner. She poured the boiling water over a single spoonful of instant coffee in her mug. The steam rose, smelling of burnt chicory and cheap beans. She did not ask where the money from the grocery jar had actually gone. She did not ask about the $5,000 that had vanished from her savings account on October 24th. To ask would be to reveal her hand. To ask would allow Helen to use her tears to wrap the theft in the warm, suffocating blanket of family emergency and necessary support. If Clara confronted them now, they would apologize with their mouths while justifying it in their hearts. They would tell her she was being selfish. They would remind her of the shelter they provided, of the moral debt she owed them for being the daughter who stayed. Instead, Clara took a slow sip of the hot coffee. The heat burned her tongue, a sharp, clean pain that helped clear the fog in her head. I'll take the money out of my transit budget, Clara said. Helen's face immediately cleared, the tension draining from her shoulders. She smiled, a small, patronizing curve of her lips that didn't reach her eyes. Thank you, sweetheart. I knew you'd understand. We all have to pull together. That's what makes a family. She reached out and patted Clara's arm. The touch was brief, light, and entirely transactional. I'm going to go wake Julian, Helen whispered, already moving toward the stairs. He needs to get his suit steamed before the traffic starts. Clara stood alone in the dark kitchen. The hum of the refrigerator returned, filling the silence left by her mother's departure. She picked up her plastic lunch container and her travel mug, then walked out of the back door into the cold, gray morning. The mist was thick, clinging to the yellow leaves of the neighbor's maple tree. The streetlights were still on, casting long, pale shadows across the wet asphalt. Clara walked down the driveway, her shoes sinking slightly into the damp grass of the verge. She walked past the family car, the 10-year-old sedan she had paid to register, insured under her name and filled with gas just 2 days ago. She reached the bus stop at the corner of Elm Street, just as the yellow headlights of the 5:50 transit bus cut through the fog. The brakes squealed, a high metallic shriek that echoed off the quiet suburban homes. Clara climbed the sticky rubber steps, dropped her $6 in coins into the fare box, and walked down the narrow aisle. She chose a seat near the back, right over the wheel well, where the vibration of the diesel engine was the strongest. She pulled her phone from her pocket and opened her banking application. She bypassed her main account and tapped on the secondary login. She stared at the transaction ledger. October 24th. Withdrawal. Branch teller. $5,000. October 24th had been a Thursday. Clara had been at work all day, processing emergency room admissions from 8 to 5. She had not left her desk. But Julian had been out. He had borrowed the car that day too, claiming he had to drop off some paperwork at the local community college. Clara zoomed in on her phone screen, her thumb hovering over the electronic image of the withdrawal slip. The bank app allowed her to view the scanned document. She tapped the icon. The image loaded slowly, pixel by pixel, in the dim light of the bus. At the bottom of the slip, in the space marked Signature of Depositor, was a line of handwriting. It was a neat, cursive imitation of her name, but the C was too rounded, and the tail of the A dragged downward, a habit Clara had never possessed, but one she had seen on her brother's high school essays for years. Beside the forged signature, in the clerk's cramped handwriting, was a brief note: ID verified, driver's license presented. Clara closed her eyes. Her physical driver's license had been in her wallet that day, but her old expired one, the one she had kept in the top drawer of her desk as a spare, had gone missing 3 months ago. She had assumed she had lost it. The bus lurched forward, throwing her slightly against the cold window pane. Clara looked out at the dark, wet streets rolling past. Her heart rate didn't elevate, her hands didn't shake. She quietly closed the banking app, locked her phone, and slid it back into her pocket. The silence inside her was complete. The St. Jude outpatient clinic smelled of floor wax, industrial lavender, and the faint, bitter tang of isopropyl alcohol. Clara sat in cubicle 4, her eyes reflecting the blue-white glare of dual 24-inch monitors. Her hands hovered over the mechanical keyboard, her fingers moving with the rapid, unthinking cadence of a stenographer. ICD-10, code M17.12. Unilateral primary osteoarthritis, left knee. ICD-10, code I10. Essential hypertension. She entered the alphanumeric strings with absolute precision. In the billing department, a single transposed digit could reject a claim, delaying a hospital's reimbursement by 90 days. Clara liked the codes. They were a language of absolute consequence. If a patient had a broken femur, there was a specific, undeniable designation for it. There was no room for interpretation, no space for emotional bargaining. The system only cared about what could be verified. "They're rejecting the pre-authorization for the MRI on bed 3 again," Sarah said from the adjacent cubicle. Sarah was 32, with 3 young children and a husband who drove a delivery truck. She was currently peeling an orange, her fingernails dug deep into the thick, dimpled skin. The sharp, sweet scent of citrus instantly cut through the stale office air, masking the smell of the carpet. "Which insurer?" Clara asked, her fingers never stopping their rhythm. Click, clack, enter. "Blue Shield," Sarah sighed, tossing a piece of orange peel into her wastebasket. It landed with a soft, hollow thud. "They're claiming the patient didn't complete the 6 weeks of physical therapy first. But the patient can barely walk. I told the representative that, and she just read the script back to me. Sometimes I feel like I'm talking to a wall, a very polite, very expensive wall." Clara kept her eyes on her screen. "They're paid to say no. Their metrics depend on how many people hang up before the appeal is filed." "I know," Sarah murmured, chewing a segment of the orange. "But it's exhausting. By the time I get home, my brain is just mush. I don't even want to talk to my kids. My husband starts talking about his route, and I just stare at the wall. Do you ever get like that?" Clara paused for a fraction of a second, her index finger resting on the page down key. "Sometimes," Clara said. In truth, Clara's brain was never mush. The exhaustion she felt was not mental fog. It was a physical weight, like wearing a lead apron in an X-ray room. Her mind remained entirely clear, hyper-focused, and constantly running calculations in the background. She looked at the digital clock in the corner of her screen, 12:15 p.m. During her 30-minute lunch break, she did not go to the break room. She remained at her desk, pulling her hard-boiled egg and cheese from her plastic container. She ate slowly, chewing each bite exactly 15 times before swallowing. With her left hand, she opened a private browser tab on her work computer. She logged into the hospital's payroll portal. The portal was secured with a two-factor authentication code sent to her phone. She entered the digits, her face washed in the soft green light of the employee dashboard. She clicked on the tab labeled Payroll Distribution. For 3 years, her direct deposit had been split into 3 streams. 45% went directly into the joint checking account at Capital One, the account her mother had access to, which paid the mortgage and Thomas's medical bills. 30% went into her personal checking account at the same bank for her own expenses. 25% went into her private secondary savings account. Clara clicked the Edit button. She did not touch the 30% for her personal checking. Instead, she opened a new window and accessed her newly created account with Apex Digital Bank, a completely paperless, online-only institution with no physical branches, no paper statements, and an interface that required facial recognition to open. She copied the routing number and the account number. She went back to the payroll portal. She deleted the destination for her 25% savings and pasted the Apex Digital Bank details in its place. Then, she looked at the 45% allocated to the joint household account. Currently, that 45% yielded exactly $1,440 a month. The mortgage on her parents' house was $980. The remaining $460 was supposed to cover Thomas's prescription copays and utilities. Clara moved her cursor to the percentage field. She deleted 45%. She typed 35%. The difference, 10%, or $320 a month, was redirected into her new, hidden Apex Digital account. She calculated the fallout. On Friday, when the payroll cleared, the joint household account would receive $1,120 instead of the usual amount. It would still cover the mortgage, but it would leave only $140 for extras. Helen would notice. She would log into the mobile app on her phone while sitting at the dining table, her brow furrowing as she looked at the lower deposit. Clara drafted the script in her head. She would not apologize. She would not look guilty. "The hospital changed our benefit structure," she would say, her voice flat and matter-of-fact. "They increased the mandatory contribution for our pension and raised the health insurance deductible. My net pay went down." Helen would not ask to see her pay stub. Helen did not know the login credentials to the hospital portal, and even if she did, she found financial documents confusing and tedious. She would simply sigh, complain about the rising cost of living, and ask Clara to buy fewer groceries the following week. Clara clicked Submit. A small green checkmark appeared on her screen. "Your payroll distribution changes have been saved. These changes will take effect on your next pay cycle. Friday, November 15th. "Clara?" Sarah's voice broke her focus. Clara immediately closed the payroll tab, returning to her billing screen before Sarah could look over the partition. "Yeah?" Clara said, her voice steady. "Did you see the email from Dr. Vance?" Sarah asked, leaning back in her chair. "They're changing our shift rotation starting next month. They want someone to cover the Saturday morning clinic. He's asking for volunteers." The Saturday morning shift was 4 hours, paid at time and a half. It was generally avoided by everyone because it ruined the weekend. Clara's internal calculator clicked into place. 4 hours of overtime at $36 an hour was $144. Over 4 weeks, that was $576 of additional, untraceable income. Income that she could direct entirely into her Apex digital account. "I'll take it," Clara said. Sarah stared at her, her orange half-eaten in her hand. "Seriously? Clara, you already work 45 hours. Don't you want a break?" "I don't mind," Clara said. "I like the quiet on Saturdays." She opened her email client, drafted a 3-word response to Dr. Vance, and hit send. The low hum of the office servers continued to vibrate through the walls. Clara picked up her blue pen, opened her leather-bound notebook, and neatly recorded the date of her next pay cycle. The first shift in her financial foundation had been made. It was small, nearly invisible, but it was set. She picked up her plastic fork and took another bite of her egg. It was cold and tasted faintly of the plastic container, but she chewed it thoroughly, her eyes already scanning the next medical file on her screen. The lock on the front door always stuck when the humidity rose. Clara had to insert her brass key, lift the door handle by exactly 1/4 of an inch, and turn it with a sharp, practiced twist. It was a physical routine she had performed thousands of times, yet every evening it felt like a silent test of patience. Inside, the house was warm and smelled of boiled cabbage and cheap garlic powder. In the kitchen, Julian was sitting at the dining table. He was still wearing his navy blue interview suit, though he had discarded his tie on the sideboard, where it lay like a dead snake among the unopened utility bills. His shirt collar was unbuttoned, revealing the pale, soft skin of his neck. He was eating a large bowl of vanilla ice cream, scraping the spoon against the sides of the ceramic bowl with a rhythmic, high-pitched screech. "The traffic on the bridge was absolute hell," Julian was saying, his mouth half full. He didn't look at Clara as she entered. He was addressing Helen, who stood by the stove, wiping down the kettle with a damp cloth. "If I'm going to be commuting to the city 3 times a week, we're going to need to look into a toll pass. It's 20% cheaper if you buy the annual transponder." "Of course, sweetheart," Helen said, her voice full of soft, eager compliance. "We'll look into it. Clara, did you hear? Julian's meeting went wonderfully. The senior partner took him into the private office. They talked for nearly an hour." Clara hung her coat on the wooden peg in the hallway. She did not ask about the details of the meeting. She did not point out that the car's fuel gauge, which had been full when she parked it on Tuesday, was now resting on the red line of empty. Julian had driven nearly 80 miles, yet the logistics office in the city was only 12 miles away. She walked to the kitchen counter, picked up her plastic lunch container, and set it in the sink. "Clara," Helen said, her voice shifting into its gentle, requesting tone. "Julian's jacket has a tiny spot on the sleeve, some coffee or something from the road. You pass the dry cleaners on the corner of 5th on your way to the bus stop tomorrow. Could you drop it off? He needs it fresh for the 2nd round of interviews next week." Clara looked at the navy blue jacket draped over the back of Julian's chair. The spot on the cuff was not coffee. It was a dark, greasy smear of hydraulic fluid, the kind one gets from leaning against the open hood of a car. "They charge $12 for a jacket," Clara said. "Well, it's an investment," Helen said, her eyebrows knitting together in mild irritation. "He can't go to a professional interview with a stained sleeve. What would they think of his family?" "I don't have $12 cash," Clara said. "Put it on your card, Clara," Julian interjected, his voice carrying a slight edge of condescending amusement. He scraped the last of the ice cream from his spoon and pointed it at her. "I'll square up with you once the first payroll from the firm clears. Don't be so tight all the time. It's a dry cleaning bill, not a mortgage payment. Clara stood by the sink, her hands resting on the cold porcelain rim. She calculated the energy required to explain that her credit card was currently at 80% capacity because she had paid for Thomas's dental work 3 weeks ago. She calculated the energy required to remind Julian that he still owed her $85 for the winter tires she had purchased for the sedan last year. She chose silence. "I'll drop it off," Clara said quietly. She turned away from them and walked over to the small white bread box on the far counter. Inside, next to a loaf of generic white bread, sat her father's medication box, a blue plastic grid with 28 compartments, 4 for each day of the week. This was her nightly task. Every evening at 7, she sorted Thomas's tablets. She pulled the 3 amber prescription bottles from the cupboard. The labels were worn, the print fading from the oils on her fingers. She popped the cap off the first bottle, the beta blockers. The small orange tablets rattled against the plastic tray as she dropped them, one by one, into the compartments labeled Morn. Clack, clack, clack. She reached for the second bottle, the diuretic. She shook it. The sound was hollow. She peered inside the amber plastic. There were only 4 white, pill-shaped tablets left at the bottom of the bottle. The prescription was out of refills. To get another bottle, she would have to call the clinic, request a new authorization, and pay the $75 deductible at the window. Usually, Clara would have made the call during her 15-minute morning break. She would have used her personal debit card to pay the $75 before her father even realized his supply was low. She had done this for 2 years, quietly keeping his health stable so the house remained quiet, so her mother wouldn't panic, so her brother wouldn't be inconvenienced by his father's illness. She stared at the 4 white pills. 4 days of medication meant Thomas would run out on Monday morning. Clara looked up. Through the doorway, she could see her father in the living room. His head was tilted back, his mouth open as he slept, the blue light of the television washing over his pale, wrinkled skin. He looked fragile, but he also looked entirely insulated from the reality of his own existence. He did not know what his medicine cost. He did not know how the mortgage was paid. He simply assumed the world would continue to rotate around his recliner, because it always had. Clara put the 4 pills into the compartments for Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. She set the empty amber bottle back in the cupboard behind the baking soda. She did not write refill in her notebook. She did not add the $75 to her weekly budget. She would let the bottle sit empty. On Monday, when Thomas realized there were no pills in the Tuesday slot, he would tell Helen. Helen would panic. Helen would search the cupboards, find the empty bottle, and inevitably ask Clara to go to the pharmacy. And Clara would tell her, with perfect administrative calm, that she did not have the $75. She would tell her that her account was short because her payroll had been adjusted. She wanted to see what Helen would do. She wanted to see if Helen would ask Julian for the money. She wanted to see if Julian, with his $5,000 of stolen savings, would part with $75 to buy his father's heart medication. "You're very quiet tonight, Clara," Julian said from the table. He had finished his ice cream and was now spinning the spoon on the wooden tabletop. The metal clicked against the veneer. Spin, clack, spin, clack. Did something happen at the clinic? "Just a long day," Clara said, her voice smooth and empty of emotion. "You should try to be more positive," Julian said, offering a small, self-satisfied smile. "Attitude is everything. That's what the regional manager told me today. He said my energy was what set me apart. People can smell negativity, Clara. It holds you back." Clara snapped the lid of the Sunday compartment shut. Click. She looked at her brother's face. His skin was smooth, his hair perfectly parted, his teeth white. He looked like a man who had never spent a single minute of his life calculating the cost of a bus fare, or the remaining ounces in a carton of milk, or the days left before a parent's heart failed. "I'll remember that," Clara said. She picked up the dry cleaning bag, took Julian's navy jacket from the chair, and walked toward the basement stairs where she kept the laundry supplies. She did not look back. The silence in her chest was growing colder, harder, and entirely unbreakable. The rain began at 4 a.m., a steady, windless drizzle that turned the fallen maple leaves on the driveway into a slick black paste. Clara walked down the street holding a black umbrella with a single broken spoke that sagged toward her shoulder, dripping cold water onto her sleeve. In her left hand, she carried Julian's navy blue interview jacket, sealed inside a thin plastic garbage bag to keep the mist from ruining the wool. The dry cleaners, Elm Street Cleaners, was located sandwiched between a shuttered hardware store and a dental clinic. When Clara stepped inside, the sudden wall of warm, humid air made her glasses instantly fog over. The shop smelled strongly of perchloroethylene, that sweet, heavy chemical solvent that always made the back of her throat feel dry, mingled with the rhythmic, escaping hiss of the commercial steam presses in the back. An elderly man with a yellow tape measure draped over his neck stood behind the counter, sorting wire hangers into a metal bin. "Morning, Clara," he said, his voice raspy. "You're early today. Got the early shift?" "Yes, Mr. Henderson," Clara said, taking off her glasses and wiping them on the dry hem of her cardigan. She laid the plastic-wrapped jacket on the high counter. "Just a light press and a spot treatment on the right cuff. It's some kind of grease." "Mr." Henderson pulled the jacket from the bag, turning the sleeve over to inspect the dark, oily smear. He grunted, reaching for a pad of pink paper slips. "Grease is tough on wool. I can get it out, but I'll have to run it through twice. It'll be ready by Wednesday afternoon." He began writing on the slip, his pencil lead thick and dull. "That'll be $14.50 with the extra solvent treatment. You want to pay now or on pickup?" Normally, Clara paid up front. It was her automatic habit, a way to ensure there were no lingering debts or small, annoying transactions waiting for her later in the week. She would have reached into her purse, pulled out her debit card, and paid the $14.50 without a second thought. "Put it under Julian's name, please," Clara said. Her voice was quiet, steady, and entirely free of hesitation. "And his phone number. He'll pay when he collects it on Wednesday." Mr. Henderson paused, his pencil hovering over the pink paper. He looked up, his faded blue eyes blinking behind his bifocals. For 10 years, Clara had handled every transaction for the household: the curtains, her father's winter coats, her mother's church dresses. "Julian?" Mr. Henderson asked, as if trying to recall the name. "My brother," Clara said, offering a small, polite nod. "He needs it for an interview. It's his jacket." "Ah, right," Mr. Henderson said. He crossed out her name at the top of the slip and wrote Julian in large, shaky block letters. He ripped the carbon copy from the pad and slid it across the counter to her. "Wednesday after 3. "Thank you," Clara said. She picked up the slip, folded it precisely into quarters, and tucked it into the zippered pocket of her purse. She did not intend to give the slip to Julian. She would leave it on the hall sideboard, right next to his car keys, where he would find it on Wednesday morning. She stepped back out into the rain, the cool air a sudden relief against her face. She walked the remaining block to the bus stop, standing under the rusted metal awning, just as her phone gave a soft, double vibration inside her pocket. It was 6:02 a.m. Her payroll had cleared. She pulled out her phone the screen illuminating her face with a pale blue glow in the gray dawn. She opened her primary banking app first. Direct deposit received, St. Jude Clinical Trust, $960. This was her personal checking. The amount was correct. Next, she logged into her new, hidden Apex Digital account. Direct deposit received, St. Jude Clinical Trust, $1,120. The numbers sat there, clean and unassailable. This was her savings, combined with the 10% she had quietly diverted from the joint household account. Finally, she opened the joint Capital One account, the one Helen used to manage the household. Direct deposit received, St. Jude Clinical Trust, $1,120. Normally, the deposit read $1,440. Clara did not close the app. She tapped on the Scheduled Transfers tab to review the upcoming automatic drafts. November 15th, today, mortgage auto draft, $168.42. November 18th, Monday, municipal water auto draft, minus $42.10. She ran the mental math with the speed of a billing program. With today's deposit of $1,120, the mortgage would draft successfully in a few hours, leaving exactly $140 in the account. But on Monday, the utilities would attempt to draft a combined total of $210.52. The account would be short by exactly $70.52. Because the account did not have overdraft protection, a feature Clara had deliberately declined when she opened the account years ago to prevent her mother from spending money they didn't have, the bank would reject the utility payments. They would charge a $35 non-sufficient funds fee for each rejected transaction. 2 rejections, $70 in fees. And the power company would send a past due notice printed on bright pink paper, arriving in the mail by Friday. Historically, Clara kept a buffer of at least $300 in her personal checking specifically to prevent this. If she saw the joint account dipping below the threshold, she would quietly transfer the difference, saying nothing, simply absorbing the cost to keep the household running smoothly. She looked at her personal checking balance, $960. She had the money. She could transfer the $75 right now with 3 taps of her thumb. It would take less than 10 seconds. She hovered her finger over the transfer funds button. From the street, the low, wet hiss of the bus tires on the asphalt signaled its arrival. The headlights cut through the heavy mist, reflecting off the puddles by the curb. Clara lowered her hand. She closed the banking application, locked her phone, and slipped it back into her pocket. She would do nothing. The bus came to a halt, the pneumatic doors folding open with a soft, sighing rush of air. Clara stepped up into the warm, vinyl-scented interior, holding her damp umbrella close to her side. She walked to her usual seat near the back, looking out the window as the bus pulled away from the curb, leaving the quiet suburb behind. The initial shift was complete. The gears had been altered, the alignment changed by just a fraction of an inch. And now, she would simply watch the machinery run. The basement of the house was always 3 degrees colder than the ground floor, smelling of damp limestone, old cardboard, and the faint, sweet trace of laundry detergent. Clara stood before the washing machine, her hands resting on the cold enamel lid. The machine was an old top-loader, its white finish yellowed around the dials, prone to a violent metal-on-concrete shaking whenever the spin cycle became unbalanced. Normally, Saturday afternoon was laundry day for the entire household. Clara's routine was unvarying. She would carry the massive, overflowing wicker basket down from the upstairs hallway. She would spend 2 hours sorting Thomas's flannel shirts, Helen's cotton house dresses, and Julian's heavy hoodies and denim into 3 distinct piles. She would run 4 consecutive loads, dry them, fold them, and carry them back up the stairs, placing the neat, warm stacks outside each bedroom door. Today, she had left the wicker baskets sitting untouched in the hallway. Instead, she had brought down only her small gray canvas bag. Inside were her 3 pairs of work trousers, 4 clinic shirts, and her undergarments. It was a single, light load. She opened the plastic bottle of lavender detergent. The liquid was thick, a deep, unnatural purple. She poured it slowly into the blue measuring cap, watching the viscous stream thread down until it reached the lower line. She did not rush. She let the last drop cling to the lip of the bottle before she capped it. The basement stairs creaked. It was the specific, slow scuff of Helen's slippers. Helen did not like the basement. She complained that the stairs were too steep for her knees, meaning Clara was almost always the one who went down. "Clara?" Helen stopped 3 steps from the bottom, her hand gripping the rough wooden railing. In her other hand, she held the pink dry cleaning slip Clara had left on the sideboard next to Julian's car keys. "I found this on the table," Helen said. Her voice carried a thin, sharp edge of annoyance, the tone of a person who had encountered an unexpected obstacle in a familiar path. "Mr. Henderson wrote Julian's name on it, and it says, 'Payment due.'" Clara did not turn around immediately. She poured the detergent into the filling tub, watching the water turn cloudy and blue under the rushing tap. "Yes," she said. "But I told you to drop it off," Helen said, her grip tightening slightly on the pink slip. "I told you to put it on your card. Julian went to get the keys just now to go to the pharmacy for your father, and he saw this. He's very upset, Clara. He doesn't have the cash on him for this right now. He had to pay $20 for parking in the city yesterday." Clara took her gray trousers from the canvas bag and dropped them into the water. They floated for a moment before absorbing the moisture and sinking. "I didn't have the $12, Clara said. Her voice was flat, level with the sound of the running tap. "You have your credit card," Helen said, her brow furrowing. She took another step down, her face coming into the dim, bare bulb light of the basement. This was not anger yet. It was the quiet confusion of someone whose domestic machinery had suddenly misfired. "You always use your card for the dry cleaning. We've always done it that way." "The limit has been reached," Clara said. She dropped a white clinic shirt into the tub. "Well, how is that possible?" Helen asked, her tone rising slightly. "You just had your payroll clear yesterday. Surely you can transfer $12 to your credit card to cover your brother's jacket. It's his only good suit, Clara. He has another call on Monday." Clara reached for the lid of the washing machine. She did not look at her mother. She calculated the exact amount of emotional energy required to explain the concept of credit limits, interest rates, and the $5,000 that had vanished from her savings. It was a massive, exhausting expenditure of energy. She chose silence. "I can't transfer it," Clara said. "Why not?" Helen's voice was sharper now, the annoyance turning into a hard, defensive demand. "It's $12, Clara. You're being incredibly difficult about this. Your brother is trying to secure a future for all of us, and you're treating a dry cleaning bill like a major crisis. It's selfish." Clara closed the lid of the washing machine. Clack. The tub began to agitate, the motor emitting a low, rhythmic growl that filled the small basement. The sound effectively swallowed the silence between them, a wall of mechanical noise that Clara used as a shield. She turned to face her mother. She did not look angry. She did not look hurt. Her face was as smooth and neutral as the medical billing screens she processed every day. "I don't have the money, Mom," Clara said. Helen stared at her. For several seconds, she seemed to search for a counter-argument, some familiar lever of guilt she could pull to make Clara comply. She looked at the pink slip in her hand, then back at Clara's blank expression. The lack of reaction from Clara seemed to disorient her more than a shout would have. "Well," Helen said, her mouth twisting into a thin, bitter line, "I suppose I'll have to find the money from your father's medicine jar. I don't know how we're going to eat this week if you're going to start hoarding every penny. Your father's joints are terrible today, and now I have to worry about this." She turned and began to climb the stairs, her slippers slapping hard against the wood. "Your brother is right," she muttered, just loud enough for Clara to hear over the washing machine. "You've got a very dark attitude lately." Clara stood by the vibrating machine. She did not follow her mother. She did not offer to take the pink slip back. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. She logged into the joint Capital One account. Available balance, $140. The mortgage payment of $980 had cleared at midnight, leaving exactly that amount. Clara calculated the timeline. Today was Saturday. The bank was closed. On Monday morning, the automatic drafts for the city electric bill, $168.42, and the water bill, $42.10, would hit the account simultaneously. There would be no deposit to save them. The account would fail. And because Julian had taken the cash from the grocery jar to pay for his dry cleaning, Helen would have nothing left in the house to cover the gap. Clara put her phone back in her pocket. She leaned against the vibrating washing machine, feeling the cold metal press against her lower back, her eyes fixed on the damp, dark stones of the basement wall. The Cold War had begun, and the first freeze was only 48 hours away. The kitchen clock ticked with a heavy plastic rhythm that seemed to slow the passage of Sunday afternoon. Clara stood at the sink, her thumb pressed hard against the side of a large, dust-covered russet potato. The peeler she used was old, its metal blade slightly rusted around the hinge, requiring a firm, scraping motion to slice through the dirty skin. With each stroke, a wet brown ribbon fell into the stainless steel sink, revealing the pale, starchy white flesh beneath. The smell of damp earth and cold water rose from the basin, a clean, silent scent that Clara preferred to the roasting chicken behind her. The chicken was smaller than usual. Helen had bought a 3-pound bird on markdown, its skin pale and dotted with loose feathers, that Clara had spent 10 minutes plucking before putting it in the oven. Helen was setting the dining table. The heavy, cream-colored plates clinked against each other as she laid them out on the faded lace tablecloth. The cloth had belonged to Helen's mother. It was yellowed at the edges, with a faint, dark ring near the center, where a gravy boat had spilled during a Christmas dinner 3 years ago. "The wind is coming from the north," Helen said, her voice carrying over the sound of the running tap. She didn't look at Clara. She was aligning the cheap, stainless steel forks with practiced, anxious precision. "It's going to freeze tonight. Your father's knees were clicking when he got out of bed. We'll need to turn the hallway radiator up to 3. Clara did not stop peeling. "The radiator in the hall leaks if it goes past 2. "Well, we can't have him freezing," Helen said, her tone tightening. "He's 72, Clara. He's not strong like you. We have to keep the house warm. Julian says the draft in the upstairs hallway is giving him a headache anyway. He's got that final interview tomorrow morning, and he needs his sleep." Julian's bedroom door opened upstairs. His heavy, slow steps sounded on the wooden stairs, each tread creaking in a familiar descending sequence. He entered the kitchen wearing a gray fleece pullover and dark sweatpants. He looked warm, his face slightly flushed from a 3-hour nap. He smelled of mint mouthwash and cheap cologne. He walked straight to the refrigerator, opened it, and stood there for several seconds, letting the cold air pour out over his bare feet. He reached for the pitcher of sweet tea, poured a glass, and sat at the table, sliding his smartphone across the lace cloth. "The sedan is practically on empty," Julian said. He picked up his phone, his thumb instantly scrolling through a feed. "The fuel light was blinking when I turned the key to go to the pharmacy earlier. I had to put $10 in just to make sure I didn't get stuck on the avenue. Clara, did you forget to fill it?" Clara dropped the peeled potato into a pot of cold water. It landed with a heavy, hollow plop, sending a small splash over her wrist. "I didn't drive it yesterday," she said. "Yeah, but you usually fill it on Saturdays," Julian said, not looking up from his screen. His voice was casual, carrying the lazy, comfortable irritation of a man who assumed his personal logistics were managed by an invisible staff. "I've got the city drive tomorrow. I can't be stopping at the mobile station at 7 in the morning in my suit. The pumps are always dirty, and I don't want gas on my sleeves." "I didn't have the cash," Clara said. Helen stopped folding the paper napkins. She stood by the head of the table, her hands resting on the back of Thomas's chair. She looked at Julian, then at Clara's back. A brief, conspiratorial glance passed between them, the look they always exchanged when they decided Clara was being difficult. "Clara, you got paid on Friday," Helen said, her voice dropping into that soft, reasoning tone she used when she wanted to make Clara's boundaries look like a personal failing. "We all have to make sacrifices for the house. The car is for everyone. If Julian misses his interview because the tank is dry, it sets all of us back. You know how important this contract is." Clara picked up the next potato. She sliced the peeler down the side, a long, thick strip of skin curling over her knuckle. She calculated the sedan's fuel tank. $10 of gas at current prices was roughly 2.5 gallons. The city office was 12 miles away. With the Monday morning bottleneck on the bridge, the car would consume nearly 2 gallons just sitting in traffic. Julian would get there, but he would not have enough fuel to return. She had $36 in her purse, tucked inside her dresser drawer. It was her transit budget for the week. She would keep it in her purse. "I don't have the cash," Clara repeated. Her voice was steady, identical in tone to her previous statement. "You're being incredibly stubborn lately," Julian said, his thumb flicking rapidly on his phone. "It's 10 gallons of gas, Clara. It's $40. You're acting like we're asking for your kidney. If you're short, just put it on the household card." "The household card has a balance of $480, Clara said, her eyes fixed on the potato in her hand. "The limit is $500. If we charge $40, the transaction will be declined, and they will charge a $30 over-limit fee." Julian sighed, a loud, theatrical sound. He threw his hands up and looked at his mother. "See? This is what I'm talking about. She's always got a spreadsheet ready to explain why she can't help. It's exhausting." "Clara," Helen said, her face flushing slightly, "that card is for emergencies. Keeping the car running for your brother's interview is an emergency. We can't just let everything fall apart because you're in a mood." From the living room, the television volume suddenly spiked. A commercial for a local car dealership blared, the announcer's voice booming through the drywall. Thomas's raspy voice followed it, calling out over the din. "What's the shouting about out there? Helen, is the dinner ready? My hip is stiff." "Just a minute, Thomas," Helen called back, her voice tight with drama. She turned back to Clara, her eyes narrowing. "We will talk about this after dinner. Your brother needs to focus tonight. I won't have you ruining his concentration with this attitude." Clara did not answer. She finished the potato, dropped it into the pot, and picked up the heavy metal lid. Clack! She set the pot on the stove, turned the burner dial until the blue flame hissed into life, and walked out of the kitchen. She did not look at her mother or her brother. She went upstairs to her small, cold bedroom, closing the door behind her until the click of the latch was the only sound left in her ears. They thought she was having a spell. They thought if they ignored her, or if they complained loud enough, she would eventually slip down to the gas station at 9 o'clock tonight to fill the tank just to keep the peace. She sat on her bed, her hands resting on her knees, listening to the water in the pot downstairs slowly begin to boil. Tomorrow was Monday. The automated drafts would hit. The peace they were trying so hard to preserve was about to end. The house woke to the smell of cheap bacon and wet wool. Clara stood by the kitchen counter at 5:40 a.m., her clinical ID badge already clipped to the pocket of her gray cardigan. The plastic laminate of the badge was cold against her thumb. Julian's navy blue interview jacket hung from the brass hook on the pantry door, encased in the clean, crinkling plastic of the dry cleaners. Helen had gone to retrieve it on Sunday night, using the last $15 from Thomas's medicine jar. The empty jar now sat on the dresser in her parents' bedroom, a hollow glass cylinder that usually held the emergency $20 bills Clara tucked inside every month. Helen was already at the stove, much earlier than her usual rising hour. She was frying 3 strips of thin, watery bacon in a small skillet, her movements stiff and deliberately noisy. She slid the spatula under the meat with a sharp metallic scrape, her back rigid. She had not spoken to Clara when Clara came downstairs. The silence between them was thick, deliberate, and weaponized, a classic domestic freeze designed to make Clara feel the weight of her stubbornness before she left for the bus. Julian sat at the dining table, his wet hair combed back into slick, neat ridges. He was wearing his crisp white dress shirt and his suit trousers, though he had left the shirt unbuttoned at the collar. He was staring at his phone, his thumb moving in slow, rhythmic swipes. "The wind is still coming from the north," Julian said, his voice husky with sleep. He did not look at Clara, directing his words toward his mother's back. "The sedan took 3 tries to turn over this morning. The battery is sluggish in the cold. It's probably the alternator." Helen flipped a strip of bacon, the hot grease popping and spitting onto the stovetop. "We'll have to get it looked at, sweetheart. Once your first check clears, we'll take it to the shop down on 4th. They're very reasonable." "If it dies on the bridge, I'm screwed," Julian muttered. He finally looked up from his screen, his gaze landing on the set of car keys lying on the counter near Clara's travel mug. He reached out, his fingers wrapping around the metal ring, jingling them with a slow, deliberate cadence. "Mom, did you find any cash for gas?" "There's $10 in the glove box," Helen said, her voice dropping into a lower, embarrassed register. "I had to use the rest for the jacket, Julian. I'm sorry. It's all we had left in the house." Julian looked at Clara. His eyes were cold, carrying a sharp, petulant anger. He jingled the keys again. Clink, clink, clink. $10 is barely 2 gallons, Julian said, his eyes still fixed on Clara. "If the bridge is backed up, I'll be idling for 40 minutes. I'll run out before I hit the city limits. But I guess some people don't care about that." Clara took a slow sip of her tea. The water was lukewarm, the tea bag having steeped too long, leaving a bitter, metallic aftertaste on her tongue. She did not look at Julian. She did not look at her mother. She calculated the energy required to explain that she had paid $90 for a new alternator 3 months ago, and that the sluggish start was simply because Julian had left the interior dome light on over the weekend. She chose silence. She picked up her travel mug, adjusted the strap of her purse over her shoulder, and walked to the front door. Behind her, the scraping of the spatula against the skillet resumed, faster this time, a sharp, angry rhythm that followed her out into the dark. The rain had stopped, but the fog was dense, hanging low over the wet lawns and the yellow street lamps. The cold, damp air instantly penetrated her cardigan, making her skin prickle beneath the wool. She walked to the bus stop, her boots squelching slightly in the mud at the edge of the asphalt. At 7:45 a.m., Clara sat at her desk in Cubicle 4 at the St. Jude outpatient clinic. The office was quiet, the only sounds being the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant, rhythmic clicking of Sarah's keyboard 3 cubicles down. Clara opened her phone and logged into the joint Capital One account. The balance was exactly $140. She clicked on the Pending Transactions tab. 2 new lines of text had appeared at the top of the ledger, marked with small gray clock icons. Pending, City Gas and Electric, $168.42. Pending, Municipal Water, $42.10. The bank's automated processing system always ran its first sweep of pending utility drafts at exactly 9 a.m. on Monday mornings. Clara stared at the numbers. The total of the 2 pending drafts was $210.52. The account was $70.52 short. She looked at her personal checking account balance on her screen. $960. She had the money. She could make a quick transfer now. The transaction would clear instantly, and the automated drafts would process without a hitch. The lights would stay on. The water would keep running. The house would remain warm and quiet. She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a clean blue ballpoint pen. She clicked the top. Click. She set her phone down on the desk, face up, the screen still glowing with the red text of the pending drafts. She picked up the first medical billing file from her stack. Patient name, Arthur Pendleton, ICD-10, code M19.011, primary osteoarthritis, right shoulder. She began typing the numbers into the clinic registry, her fingers moving with a steady, unhurried precision. At 9:03 a.m., her phone screen lit up on her desk. It did not vibrate. She had turned the sound off, but the lock screen displayed a notification from the Capital One mobile app. The notification was not for Clara's personal account. Because she had set up the mobile banking app on her phone using the joint account credentials 3 years ago to monitor the bills, she received the same automated alerts that were sent to Helen's phone. Capital One alert. Your account ending in 4092 is overdrawn by -$63.94. A non-sufficient funds fee of $35 has been applied. 3 seconds later, a second notification slid down the screen. Capital One alert. Your account ending in 4092 is overdrawn by -$141.04. A non-sufficient funds fee of $35 has been applied. The total overdraft, including the $70 in penalties, now stood at -$141.04. Clara did not swipe the notifications away. She let the screen dim and go black. She picked up her blue pen, flipped to the next page of the medical file, and continued to type. The machinery of their own choices had finally cleared the first hurdle, and Clara's hands remained entirely clean. The front door opened with its familiar, heavy groan, but the air inside the house felt different tonight. The usual dull warmth of the hallway was missing, replaced by a quiet, stagnant chill. Clara stepped onto the linoleum, her boots leaving 2 dark, wet prints on the faded mat. She hung her heavy coat on the brass peg. Immediately, she noticed Julian's leather dress shoes thrown near the radiator. They were soaked, the leather puckered and gray at the toes, smelling of wet cardboard and street grime. The stove was dark. There was no smell of dinner, no sound of water boiling. In the living room, Thomas was sitting in his recliner, but the television was muted. He was staring at the blank screen, his chin resting on his chest, his hands tucked deep into his pockets to keep them warm. "Clara?" Helen emerged from the kitchen. She wasn't wearing her floral fleece robe today. She was still in her gray knit sweater, her face pale and pinched. She held her smartphone in both hands, her fingers clutching the plastic case so tightly her knuckles were white. "Thank God you're home," Helen whispered, her voice carrying a shaky, breathless quality. She took 2 quick steps toward Clara, her eyes wide with a frantic, pleading energy. "Something is wrong with the account. The bank. They sent these terrible text messages. I tried to call them, but the automated voice kept asking for a PIN I don't know, and then it hung up on me." She thrust the phone toward Clara's face. The blue light of the screen reflected off Clara's glasses. Clara did not take the phone. She gently reached out, adjusted her glasses, and looked at the screen while keeping her hands by her sides. "It says the electric bill was returned," Helen said, her finger tapping the glass. "And the water bill. And look at this. They took $35, twice, for non-sufficient funds. That's $70, Clara, for nothing, just for sending a text. It has to be a mistake. Your payroll went in on Friday. I saw the alert." Clara looked from the screen to her mother's face. Helen's skin was dry, the small wrinkles around her eyes twitching slightly. She looked entirely disoriented, like a passenger in a car that had suddenly lost its brakes. "It's not a mistake," Clara said. Her voice was smooth, carrying the same clinical, professional tone she used when explaining insurance rejections to patients at the clinic. "What do you mean?" Helen's voice rose, a sharp, thin squeak. "Of course it's a mistake. The mortgage went through. But there should be $460 left. There's always enough for the utilities, Clara. We've never had a bounce. Never." "The hospital adjusted our benefit structure starting this month," Clara said, delivering the script she had rehearsed in her head with perfect, unhurried cadence. "They increased the mandatory pension contribution and raised the premium for our health deductible. My net pay went down." Helen stared at her, her mouth slightly open. Your pay went down? By how much?" $320 a month," Clara said. 300. Helen repeated the number as if it were a foreign word. She looked down at her phone, then back at Clara, her expression shifting from panic to a deep, resentful confusion. "But why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you say something before Friday?" "I told you on Saturday," Clara said quietly. "I told you I didn't have the cash." "I thought you were just being difficult," Helen cried, her voice cracking. She quickly glanced toward the stairs, then lowered her pitch to a harsh, intense whisper. "Clara, this is a disaster. The utilities are overdrawn. The account is negative. If we don't pay the $75 overdraft and the bills by tomorrow, they're going to charge us late fees. And the power, they'll send a shut-off notice. You have to transfer the money from your personal checking. Just $50 to clear the negative balance, and then we'll figure out the rest." Clara took her leather-bound notebook from her purse. She opened it, her fingers turning the pages with a dry, rustling sound until she reached her personal budget ledger. "I don't have $50, Clara said. "Of course you do," Helen said, a nervous, high-pitched chuckle escaping her throat. She reached out, her hand hovering near Clara's wrist, though she didn't make physical contact. "You always have a savings, Clara. You're so good with your money. Just a small transfer. I'll pay you back next month, I promise. Once Julian's first check comes in." Clara looked down at her ledger. The blue ink was neat, the columns perfectly aligned. "My personal checking is at 0, Clara said, her voice entirely level. "I had to pay $75 for Dad's prescription copay on Tuesday, and the bus fare for the last 3 days cost $36 because Julian had the car. I have exactly $12 in my wallet." Helen's hand dropped to her side. She looked as if Clara had spoken to her in a completely different language. The comfortable safety net she had relied on for 5 years. The silent, invisible buffer that absorbed every mistake, every overdraft, and every whim, had suddenly turned to stone. But what about your savings?" Helen whispered, her eyes darting toward the hallway stairs again. "The account you used for the tires last year, the one at the Elm Street branch." Clara looked her mother directly in the eyes. Her gaze was steady, cold, and entirely empty of guilt. "That account has been closed," Clara said. Helen flinched. "Closed? When?" "October 24th, Clara said. She watched her mother's face closely. Helen didn't ask why it had been closed. She didn't look surprised that the account was gone. Instead, a brief, guilty shadow flickered across her features, her eyes dropping to her slippers for a fraction of a second before she recovered. October 24th was the day Julian had withdrawn $5,000 using Clara's expired ID. Helen knew. She had always known. She had likely been the one who found the spare key, or at the very least, she had looked the other way while her golden son gutted his sister's future to fund his latest investment. "Well," Helen stammered, her voice shaking as she stepped back. We have to do something. We can't live in a dark house. We can't let your father freeze. Can't you ask the hospital for an advance? Or a small loan from one of your friends at the clinic?" Clara closed her notebook. The soft thwack of the leather cover was the only sound in the chilly kitchen. "No," Clara said, "I can't do that." She walked past her mother, her boots clicking softly on the floor. She picked up her travel mug from the counter, filled it with cold tap water from the sink, and turned to face the stairs. "Julian's interview was today," Clara said, her voice mild, almost conversational. "Did he get the contract?" Helen's face crumpled, a mask of bitter, defensive pride settling over her features. She clutched her phone to her chest. The car ran out of gas on the bridge approach," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He had to walk 3 miles in the rain to get to the office. He was late, Clara. He was 40 minutes late, and his suit was soaked. He's upstairs now. He's completely devastated." Clara took a slow sip of the cold water. It tasted faintly of iron and old copper pipes, but it was incredibly refreshing. "That's too bad," Clara said. She turned and began to walk up the dark stairs, her steps slow, measured, and entirely unhurried, leaving her mother standing alone in the cold, silent kitchen. The kitchen was so cold that Clara's breath left her mouth in a faint gray plume that vanished against the yellowing plaster of the ceiling. Helen had turned the thermostat down to 58 degrees overnight. It was her mother's silent, frantic attempt to claw back the $70 deficit the bank had claimed in overdraft fees. The old radiator in the corner of the room was dead, its cold iron emitting a faint, metallic smell of rust and old water. Clara stood at the counter, her heavy winter coat zipped to her chin. Her physical routine was unchanged. She took a slice of white bread from the bag. It was slightly stale, the crust dry and stiff. She used a butter knife to scrape a thin layer of margarine across the surface. The scraping sound was sharp, echoing loudly in the quiet house. Scritch, scritch. On the shelf beside the bread box sat the blue plastic pill box. Clara looked at it. The compartments for Monday were empty. The compartment for Tuesday, today, was also empty. There were no orange beta blockers. There were no white diuretics. From the bedroom down the hall, a dry, raspy cough broke the silence. Thomas was awake. He was still in his bed, his body stiff from the cold, his heart struggling to maintain its rhythm without the chemical stabilizers he had taken every morning for the last 2 years. He would feel the fluttering in his chest by noon. He would feel the breathlessness by 3. The basement door clicked open. Julian stepped into the kitchen. He was not wearing his suit today. He was in his gray, food-stained sweatpants and a faded black t-shirt that smelled faintly of old sweat and damp tobacco. His eyes were bloodshot, surrounded by dark purple hollows. He hadn't shaved, and the rough, dark stubble on his jaw made his face look bloated and small. He did not walk to the refrigerator. He stood in the narrow gap between the counter and the dining table, blocking Clara's path to the hallway. "You think you're really smart, don't you?" Julian said. His voice was low, carrying a raw, gravelly edge. Clara did not look up from her toast. She sliced the bread diagonally, creating 2 neat, identical triangles. "You knew the tank was dry," Julian spit, taking a half-step closer. The smell of his unwashed body reached her, warm and sour in the freezing room. "You knew I had the interview on Monday, and you left the car on fumes. You did it on purpose. You wanted me to walk. You wanted me to look like a fool." Clara's internal calculator clicked into place. Emotional response, 0%. Energy output to defend her actions, 45%. Energy output to remain silent, 1%. She picked up a triangle of toast and took a bite. The dry bread crunched loudly between her teeth. "Don't play dumb with me, Clara," Julian said, his voice rising, his chest heaving under his t-shirt. He was terrified. His interview had been a disaster, his suit was ruined, and the $5,000 he had stolen was likely sitting in a digital ledger somewhere, frozen or lost to his crypto advisor. He needed a target. He needed to make his failure her fault. "Mom said you closed your Elm Street account. Why did you close it?" He was leaning forward now, his fingers gripping the edge of the laminate counter. He was trying to look threatening, but Clara could see the microscopic tremor in his index finger. He was trying to gauge if she had found out about the forgery. He was desperately searching her face for any sign of accusation. "The money is gone," Clara said. She swallowed the dry bread. Her voice was flat, empty of inflection, carrying the absolute weight of a clinical fact. Julian's jaw tightened, his skin turning a sickly grayish white. "What do you mean, gone? You had thousands in there. You've been hoarding your money while Mom struggles to pay the electric. Where did it go?" "It's gone," Clara repeated. She looked him directly in the eyes. She did not accuse him. She did not mention the forged signature or the expired driver's license. She simply let the statement hang in the cold air between them, a heavy, silent mirror reflecting his own crime back at him. Julian flinched. He looked away first, his eyes darting to the floor, then to the window, his thumb rubbing nervously against the seam of his sweatpants. "You're lying. You're just hoarding it somewhere else. You're trying to freeze us out. If the lights go dark on Friday, it's on you. You're the one with the job. You're the one who's supposed to be supporting this family." He turned on his heel and slammed his fist against the kitchen door frame as he left, the wood rattling in its casing. Clara did not jump. She did not look at the door frame. She took her smartphone from her pocket. She did not open her banking application. Instead, she opened a local rental database. She clicked on her saved folder. Listing, studio apartment, 410 square feet, Electric baseboard heat. 5 blocks from St. Jude Clinic. $850 per month. Utilities separate. Available December 1st. She had $1,120 sitting in her secret Apex Digital account. By the time her next paycheck cleared on Friday, November 29th, she would have another deposit. She would have more than enough for the first month's rent, the security deposit, and a set of basic kitchen utensils. She clicked the schedule viewing button on the screen. She selected Saturday, November 23rd at 2 p.m., right after her scheduled overtime shift at the clinic. She submitted the request. The screen blinked, a small green banner appearing at the top. Your viewing request has been sent to the property manager. Clara closed the application and slid the phone back into her cardigan pocket. She picked up her travel mug of lukewarm tea and her container of dry toast. She walked out of the kitchen, past the quiet living room where her father was now sitting, his hand pressed against his left side as he tried to catch his breath in the freezing air. "Clara," Thomas called out, his voice a faint, wheezing whistle. Where are the white pills? The little ones. My chest feels tight." Clara stopped by the front door. She looked at her father. She felt no anger toward him, but she also felt no urge to save him. The time for her invisible labor had passed. "I don't know, Dad," Clara said quietly. "You'll have to ask Mom." She opened the sticking front door, stepped out into the gray November fog, and closed the door behind her, the lock clicking into place with a cold, final snap. The break room at the St. Jude outpatient clinic was situated in the basement, directly beneath the physical therapy ward. Every 40 seconds, the low, rhythmic thump of a patient walking on a treadmill vibrated through the acoustic ceiling tiles, a dull, physical heartbeat that Clara had learned to ignore over the years. It was 4:15 p.m. on Tuesday. Clara's shift did not end for another 45 minutes, but she had completed her daily billing queue 20 minutes ahead of schedule. She sat at the circular laminate table in the corner, farthest from the humming vending machine. The machine's fluorescent bulb was dying, casting a rapid, purple flicker over the rows of potato chips and plastic bottles of diet soda. The air in the room carried the stale, burnt smell of French roast coffee from the communal pot that had been left on the burner since noon. Clara took her smartphone from her pocket. She did not use her personal phone. She had retrieved her work-issued landline handset from her desk, cradling the heavy, cream-colored plastic receiver between her shoulder and her ear. She pressed the numbers on the keypad, 1-800-409-2182. The line beeped, followed by the tinny, digitized sound of synthesized piano music. It was a loop of a classical melody, compressed so badly that the high notes crackled in the receiver. "Thank you for calling Capital One Fraud Operations," an automated voice said, its tone bright and entirely artificial. "For English, press 1. Clara pressed 1. The keypad beeped. She waited through 3 more automated prompts, her fingers resting flat on the table's cold, faux wood surface. She traced a tiny, circular scratch in the laminate with her index finger, her movements slow and completely rhythmic. "Fraud Operations, this is Marcus. May I have your name and account number, please?" "Clara Vance," she said. Her voice was quiet, steady, and devoid of the nervous, hurried tone that customer service representatives usually encountered when dealing with theft. "The account in question is a secondary savings account ending in 7014. "Thank you, Ms. Vance. And for verification, could you confirm your billing address and the last 4 digits of your Social Security number?" Clara provided the details. She knew her Social Security number by heart. It was a sequence of 9 digits she had typed into hundreds of employment, tax, and medical forms since she was 18. "I see the account here," Marcus said, the soft, rapid clicking of his keyboard sounding over the line. "How can I help you today?" "I want to report an unauthorized withdrawal," Clara said. On October 24th, $5,000 was removed from the account at the Elm Street branch. The clicking of the keyboard stopped. "October 24th, I see that transaction here, Ms. Vance. It was processed as a branch teller withdrawal. Our records show the teller verified the transaction using a physical driver's license. My physical driver's license was in my possession at my workplace, St. Jude Clinic, on October 24th, Clara said. I have electronic security badge logs proving I entered the building at 7:55 a.m. and did not exit until 5:02 p.m. The Elm Street branch is 4 miles from this location. I did not make the withdrawal." "I see," Marcus said. His tone shifted, becoming more professional, more guarded. "Do you believe someone had access to your home or personal belongings? A family member or roommate?" Clara looked at the vending machine. A plastic coil inside groaned as it adjusted, dropping a bag of pretzels into the metal bin below with a hollow rattle. "My brother, Julian Vance, has access to the house," Clara said. She did not hesitate. She did not feel the rising heat of family loyalty or the cold dread of exposure. It was simply an administrative detail. "He had access to my desk drawer where my old, expired driver's license was kept." "Okay," Marcus said. The keyboard clicked again, a long, continuous run of typing. Because this was a branch teller withdrawal, verified with physical identification, to dispute this transaction and begin a formal investigation, we will need to file an affidavit of forgery. This is a legal document. Once filed, our security team will request the security camera footage from the Elm Street branch for the date and time of the transaction. "I understand," Clara said. "And Ms. Vance, I need to be very clear with you," Marcus continued, his voice dropping into a solemn, rehearsed register. "If the security footage reveals that a family member or someone known to you made this withdrawal using your identification, the bank will proceed with criminal prosecution to recover the funds. We cannot reverse the $5,000 to your account without a police report being filed. Do you wish to proceed with the affidavit of forgery under these terms?" Clara looked up at the ceiling. The treadmill upstairs thumped. Thump, thump, thump. Julian had spent the $5,000. She knew he had. It was likely gone, converted into digital currency, or handed over to some online broker who had stopped answering his emails. He would not be able to pay it back. When the bank's security team pulled the footage from October 24th, they would see a 30-year-old man with a neat part in his hair, presenting a stolen, expired ID and signing his sister's name with a downward drag on the A. They would identify him. They would contact the local precinct. And Helen would realize that her golden son was not just a dreamer, he was a felon. "Yes," Clara said. "I wish to proceed." "Very well," Marcus said. "I am generating the affidavit of forgery packet now. I will email it to the address on file, clara.vance@stjudeclinical.org. You will need to sign it in the presence of a notary public and return it to us, along with a copy of your work attendance log for October 24th. Once we receive the notarized document, the investigation will take 7 to 10 business days." "Thank you," Clara said. "Is there anything else I can help you with today, Ms. Vance?" "No," Clara said. "That's all." She hung up the receiver. She sat in the dim break room for several seconds, her hands still resting on the cream-colored plastic of the phone. The email notification chimed on her phone in her pocket. She pulled it out. The sender was Capital One Document Services. The subject line read, "Action required. Affidavit of forgery. Case number 99201-F. Clara looked at her watch. 4:32 p.m. She stood up, walked to the printer in the hallway, and retrieved her gray canvas bag. She would print the document tomorrow morning during her first 10-minute break. Dr. Vance was a notary. He kept his seal in his desk drawer to sign patient guardianship forms. She would ask him to stamp the document on Thursday. She walked back to her cubicle, her steps light, her mind already calculating the next sequence of events. The foundation was laid, the legal machinery was moving, and all she had to do was sign her name in the presence of a witness. The multifunction printer in the clinic's administrative hallway emitted a high-pitched, mechanical whine as it warmed up, followed by the dry, metallic smell of heated toner and ozone. Clara stood before the machine, her hand resting on the plastic paper tray. Through the glass window of the fire door behind her, she could hear the muffled, rhythmic clatter of plastic charts being slotted into metal wall racks in the outpatient lobby. The printer clicked, an internal roller spinning with a sudden, heavy thrum. A single sheet of paper slid into the output tray, slightly curled at the edges from the heat of the fuser. Clara picked it up. The paper was warm against her palms. Capital One Fraud Operations, Form 109-A, Affidavit of Forgery. She carried the paper back to Cubicle 4. The office was quiet at 8:20 a.m., the first patients of the morning still filling out their clipboards at the front desk. She sat in her mesh-backed chair, smoothed the printed document flat on her desk, and picked up a black gel pen. The document was structured with clinical precision. It required her to state, under penalty of perjury, that she did not authorize, benefit from, or receive any portion of the $5,000 withdrawn from her account on October 24th. Near the bottom of the page was a section marked Suspect Information, if known. Clara did not hesitate. Her hand was steady, her pen moving across the white paper with a smooth, unhurried stroke. She did not leave the space blank. She did not write unknown to let the bank's security team do the slow, tedious work of facial recognition. In the space provided, she wrote Julian Vance. Beneath it, she wrote his date of birth, his relationship to her, brother, and his physical description. Male, 6 feet 1 inch, approximately 190 pounds, brown hair, brown eyes. By writing his name, she was bypassing the bank's standard bureaucratic delays. The fraud investigators would not have to search their database of local branch regulars. They would pull the security footage from the Elm Street branch on October 24th, compare it directly to Julian's description, and forward the package to the local precinct within 48 hours of receiving the notarized form. She set the pen down. She stood up and walked down the short, gray-carpeted corridor to the security alcove. David, the clinic's IT and security coordinator, was sitting in a swivel chair, a wooden toothpick resting in the corner of his mouth. He was watching a grid of 12 security monitors displaying the parking lot, the main lobby, and the rear loading dock. "Hey, David," Clara said, leaning against the doorframe. David spun his chair around, the toothpick shifting as he smiled. "Morning, Clara. What can I do for you?" "I need a certified printout of my badge scans for Thursday, October 24th, she said. "I have a dispute with my bank regarding a transaction that afternoon, and I need to prove my physical presence in the building." David shrugged, his fingers immediately clicking across his mechanical keyboard. Clack, clack, clack. "Sure thing. October 24th. Let's see. Vance, Clara." The screen blinked, displaying a long column of digital timestamps. "Here we go," David said, pointing his pen at the screen. "You swiped in at the rear employee entrance at 7:52 a.m. You swiped into the break room at 12:04 p.m. Swiped back into the administrative wing at 12:31 p.m. And you swiped out of the building at 5:04 p.m. No exit scans in between. You were locked in tight all day. He clicked the printer icon on his screen. The small laser printer beside his desk hummed into life, spitting out a single page. David pulled it from the tray, reached into his drawer for a red rubber stamp, and pressed it firmly onto the bottom of the paper. St. Jude Clinic, official record, internal security. He signed his initials across the red ink with a blue pen. There you go. That should hold up with any bank in the country. Thank you, David, Clara said, taking the paper. No problem. Hope you get your money back, he said, turning back to his monitors. Clara walked back to her desk. She placed the security log behind the pink fraud affidavit. She reached for her heavy silver stapler. Thunk! The steel staple bit through the 2 sheets of paper, securing them together. She calculated her timeline. Today was Wednesday, November 20th. Dr. Vance would notarize the document tomorrow morning. She would mail it via certified mail on Friday, November 22nd. The bank would receive it by Monday, November 25th. By December 4th, the fraud investigation would be complete, and the $5,000 would be reversed into her new Apex digital account. And by December 4th, Julian would have a police file. She opened her drawer to place the stapled packet inside her canvas bag. As she did, her personal phone on the desk gave a low, double-pulse vibration. She picked it up. It was a text message from Helen. Clara, please call me. Your father is very sick. His ankles are swollen like balloons, and he is having trouble catching his breath. He couldn't sleep last night because of the chest tightness. We don't have the money for the pharmacy, and the bank account is still negative. Julian had to walk to the grocery store in the rain to get some aspirin, but it isn't helping. Please, Clara, we need you to help us. Clara read the words twice. Her expression did not change. Her pulse remained a steady, calm 64 beats per minute. She looked at the empty blue pillbox on her mind's counter. Today was Wednesday. Thomas had been without his medication for 48 hours. His heart was beginning to work twice as hard to pump blood through his swollen, fluid-filled limbs. It was a physical consequence of a financial choice. If Helen had not allowed Julian to take the $5,000, there would have been $75 for the pharmacy. If Julian had not spent the grocery money on his dry cleaning, there would have been cash in the jar. They had chosen the suit over the medicine. They had chosen the golden sun over the father's heart. And now they wanted Clara to pay the price for their alignment. She did not reply to the text. She did not dial her mother's number. She placed the phone face down on the corner of her desk, picked up her black gel pen, and reached for the next billing file in her stack. Patient name, Margaret Sullivan, ICD-10, code J4 4.9. Chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, unspecified. She began to type, the rhythmic, empty sound of the keys filling the small cubicle like a shield against the rising panic of the world outside. The rain had returned by the time Clara's bus reached her corner, a cold, needle-like sleet that hissed against the asphalt and rattled through the bare branches of the maples. When she opened the front door, the house was dark. The only illumination came from the green digital display of the microwave in the kitchen, casting a weak, watery light across the linoleum. The thermostat was still set to 58 degrees, and the air inside the hallway felt heavy and damp, holding the stagnant smell of cold grease and her father's wintergreen ointment. From the living room, a dry, rhythmic sound filled the silence. Wheeze, pause, click, wheeze. Thomas was propped up in his brown vinyl recliner, 3 flat bed pillows stuffed behind his back to keep his torso upright. His chest was heaving under his flannel shirt, his shoulders lifting with every shallow, rattling breath. His legs were elevated on the footrest, his ankles swollen so tightly against his gray wool socks that the skin above the fabric looked white and stretched, like a sausage casing on the verge of splitting. Helen was standing in the doorway of the dining room, her hands tucked into the sleeves of her sweater, her shoulders hunched. When the front door clicked shut, she flinched, her eyes immediately darting to Clara. Helen's face was haggard. Deep gray shadows had settled beneath her eyes, and her hair was greasy, clinging to her forehead in thin, messy strands. "Clara," Helen whispered, her voice cracking as she rushed forward. She grabbed Clara's arm, her fingers cold and trembling as they dug into the sleeve of Clara's cardigan. "Why didn't you call me? Why didn't you answer? Your father. His heart is jumping. He can't lie down. He spent the whole night sitting in that chair, gasping for air." Clara did not look at her father. She kept her eyes on her mother's hands, watching the pale knuckles strain against the thin wool of her sweater. "I was processing the billing backlog," Clara said. Her voice was flat, carrying the empty, neutral cadence of a recorded announcement. "My phone was in my desk drawer." "We need the money, Clara," Helen pleaded, her grip tightening until her nails pressed into Clara's skin. "I called the doctor's office. They said if he doesn't get the beta blockers by tonight, we have to take him to the county hospital. But the ambulance, they'll charge us, and the bank account is still negative. The pharmacy won't give us the medicine without the $75. Please, Clara, you must have something. Check your drawer, check your purse. There has to be something left." Clara gently reached down and unclasped her mother's fingers from her sleeve. The movement was slow, deliberate, and entirely free of anger. "I have $12 in my wallet," Clara said. "I told you that yesterday." "Just give her the card, Clara," a voice broke from the darkness of the hallway stairs. Julian was sitting on the third step, his knees drawn up to his chest, his large frame hunched in the shadows. He was wearing his heavy gray sweatpants and a dirty fleece jacket. He was chewing on his thumbnail, his eyes wild and dark as they glared at Clara through the gloom. "You're literally letting Dad choke to death over $75, Julian spit, his voice carrying a sharp, petulant whine. "What is wrong with you? You're sitting on your money while he's sitting in that chair gasping. If he goes into arrest, it's on your hands. You're the one who refused to fill the car, and now you're refusing to pay for his medicine." Clara turned her head to look at her brother. The darkness of the hallway made his features look sharp and hollow, like a caricature of a man. He had $5,000 of her money, or rather, he had taken it and let it dissolve into whatever digital black hole he had chosen. He had the dry-cleaned suit upstairs. He had a computer. He had a gold watch their grandfather had left him. He could have walked to the pawn shop 3 blocks away. He could have sold his monitor. He could have asked one of his business associates for $100. But he hadn't. He had sat on the stairs waiting for Clara to return, waiting for her to absorb the physical and financial consequences of his theft so he could keep his hands clean. "The card is at its limit," Clara said to Julian. Her tone was completely level, empty of accusation, empty of emotion. "If you have $75, you should go to the pharmacy." Julian flinched, his jaw tightening as he pressed his back against the wooden railing. "I don't have $75. I'm in between things, and you know it. You're the one with the clinical salary. You're the one who's supposed to be taking care of this." "Then we have to wait," Clara said. "Wait for what?" Helen cried, her voice rising to a hysterical, thin squeak. "For him to die? Clara, please, he's your father." Clara did not answer. She picked up her canvas bag from the floor, walked past her mother, and began to climb the stairs. She did not look at Julian as she passed him. She climbed the steps one by one, avoiding the third step from the top because it creaked, and went into her small, cold bedroom. She closed the door. The lock clicked into the frame. She did not turn on the light. She stood in the center of the dark room, listening to the rain beat against the glass of her window, accompanied by the faint, rhythmic rattle of her father's breathing, drifting up through the heating vent in the floor. Wheeze, pause, click, wheeze. She reached under her bed and pulled out her sturdy canvas duffel bag. She unzipped it, her movements slow and completely silent. She did not pack clothes. That would be too noticeable if Helen came into her room to search for money while she was at work. Instead, she began to pack her documentation. One by one, she laid her papers at the bottom of the bag: her original birth certificate, her social security card, her high school diploma, her clinical registrar certification, her physical tax returns from the last 5 years, and the ownership title to the sedan, which was registered solely in her name. She placed her physical ledger, the black notebook containing every transaction, every utility bill, and every medical expense she had paid for the last 5 years, on top of the documents. She zipped the bag shut. The metal teeth of the zipper made a soft, continuous hiss in the dark. She slid the bag back under the bed, pushing it deep into the corner behind a stack of old winter blankets where no one would think to look. The legal documents were secure. Her finances were redirected. Her apartment viewing was scheduled for Saturday. She sat on the edge of her mattress, her hands resting flat on her knees, staring at the dark wall as the house below her continued to freeze, the machinery of their choices grinding slowly toward its inevitable physical conclusion. The office of Dr. Robert Vance, the medical director of the St. Jude Outpatient Clinic, always smelled of aged paper, leather-bound reference books, and a faint, clean trace of cedarwood cologne. It was a quiet, carpeted sanctuary situated at the very end of the administrative corridor, far removed from the sharp antiseptic odors and chaotic clatter of the outpatient lobby. It was 9:15 a.m. on Thursday. Clara stood before the heavy mahogany desk. Dr. Vance was not a relative, despite the shared surname, a common administrative coincidence in the county, but he had treated Clara with a distant, professional kindness since she had joined the clinical staff. He was a tall man in his late 50s, his silver hair neatly parted, wearing wire-rimmed reading glasses that sat low on his nose. On the desk between them lay the affidavit of forgery packet, its pink cover sheet bright against the dark wood of the desk. Dr. Vance picked up the document, his fingers turning the pages with a slow, dry rustle. His eyes scanned the lines of text, stopping briefly on the section where Clara had printed her brother's physical description and name in black ink. Suspect: Julian Vance, brother. The room was completely quiet, save for the low, rhythmic hum of the desktop computer monitor in the corner. On the wall behind the desk, a heavy regulator clock with a brass pendulum swung back and forth, its movement entirely silent, though the wooden casing emitted a faint, deep throb with every second. Doctor. Vance took off his reading glasses and set them on the desk with a soft clink. He looked up at Clara, his expression guarded but gentle. "You're certain about this, Clara?" he asked, his voice low and measured. "This isn't an internal bank dispute. Once I notarize this, and once you submit it to their fraud division, it becomes a formal criminal report. They will review the branch footage. They will verify the identity of the person on that camera, and they will forward the file to the county sheriff's department." Clara stood with her hands clasped loosely in front of her. Her back was straight, her shoulders relaxed. "I understand, Doctor." "Julian is your older brother, is he not?" "He is," Clara said. Dr. Vance looked at the document again, his thumb rubbing the corner of the pink page. He had known Clara for 4 years. He had seen her cover double shifts during the flu season without a single complaint. He had seen her process thousands of patient files with a meticulous, quiet dedication, while her personal life remained entirely locked behind her calm, neutral expression. He knew, without asking, the heavy, unacknowledged weight she carried for her household. He did not pry. He did not ask how $5,000 had been removed from her savings, or why her brother had her expired identification. "Very well," Dr. Vance said quietly. He opened his bottom desk drawer with a dull, heavy slide of wood on metal. From it, he retrieved a heavy cast-iron notary seal, a black mechanical clamp with a brass handle worn smooth from decades of pressure. He slid his official notary journal toward Clara. "Sign on line 42, please, and print your name below it." Clara took his heavy silver fountain pen. The metal was cool in her hand. She signed her name with a smooth, unhurried stroke. The blue ink flowed cleanly onto the cream-colored paper of the journal, her signature identical to the one on her clinical ID badge. "Doctor." Vance took the pen back, signed his own name in the witness column, and noted his commission expiration date, June 12th, 2029. He picked up the pink affidavit of forgery. He aligned the heavy jaws of the iron seal over the bottom left corner of the page, right beside her signature. His hand closed over the brass lever, and he pressed down with a slow, firm crunch. Clack thump. The sound was heavy, final. When Dr. Vance released the lever and slid the paper out, the fibers of the sheet were permanently deformed, embossed with a crisp, circular seal that read, "Robert Vance, Notary Public, State of County Record." He repeated the process on the second page, securing her security badge log to the packet. He slid the document back across the desk to her. "It is legally binding now, Clara. You'll need to send it via certified mail to ensure they record the exact date of receipt." "I have the envelope ready," Clara said, taking the warm, embossed papers. "I'm going to the post office during my lunch break." Dr. Vance nodded. He replaced his reading glasses, his eyes already returning to the patient chart open on his computer screen. "You're a very capable registrar, Clara. You deserve to have your hard work protected." "Thank you, Doctor," Clara said. She turned and walked out of the office, closing the heavy mahogany door behind her with a soft, clean click. In her cubicle, she slid the notarized packet into a flat, cardboard priority mail envelope. She sealed the adhesive flap, pressing it down with her thumb until the glue was locked. She wrote the bank's fraud division address on the front in bold, black marker. She checked her phone. There was a single missed call from her mother's number, but no voicemail. The screen also displayed an automated notification from her banking application. Capital One alert. Your joint checking account ending in 4092 remains in a negative status of minus $141.04. Continued negative balance may result in account suspension. Clara swiped the notification away. She opened her purse, reached into the small zippered compartment, and pulled out her cash. She had exactly $12, one $10 bill and two ones. The certified mail fee with a return receipt would cost $4.40. It was a necessary transaction. It would leave her with $7.60 for the rest of the week, enough for 2 simple lunches of bread and cheese. She placed the cash back in her purse, slid her cardboard envelope under her arm, and looked at her watch. 11:55 a.m. The post office was 3 blocks away through the cold, gray sleet of the afternoon. She stood up, zipped her winter coat to her chin, and walked toward the clinic's exit doors, her steps slow, measured, and entirely clear of hesitation. The legal fuse had been lit, and the countdown had officially begun. The sleet had turned into a heavy, wet slush by the time Clara reached the corner of 5th and Elm. The rubber soles of her work boots made a soft, squelching sound with every step, sinking into the gray ridges of ice that lined the curb. She held the cardboard priority mail envelope flat against her chest, protected beneath the front flap of her zipped winter coat. The cardboard was stiff, its hard edges pressing against her ribs with a reassuring pressure. The post office was a low brick building from the late 1960s, its flat roof stained with dark streaks of coal dust and wet leaves. Inside, the lobby was warm and smelled heavily of industrial floor wax, damp cardboard, and the sour odor of wet wool coats. A row of low-hanging fluorescent tubes buzzed overhead, one of the bulbs flickering with a rapid, rhythmic pulse that cast a stuttering shadow across the tiled floor. Clara walked to the high wooden counter on the side wall, where the shipping supplies were kept. She reached into her pocket and retrieved a green USPS certified mail form, Form 3800, and the small green domestic return receipt card, Form 3811. She had taken them from the clinic's mailroom the day before. She picked up a cheap blue ballpoint pen chained to the desk. The plastic barrel of the pen was greasy, worn smooth by thousands of hands. She wrote the bank's fraud address in the To section of the certified form, her handwriting small, neat, and perfectly legible. On the return receipt card, in the space marked Sender, she did not write her home address. She wrote, Clara Vance, St. Jude Outpatient Clinic, Cubicle 4104, Medical Plaza Drive. She did not want the pink receipt card, the physical proof that the bank had signed for the forgery packet, to arrive in the mailbox at her parents' house. If Helen saw a certified receipt from a bank's fraud division, she would ask questions. She would show it to Julian. This card would come directly to her desk. She peeled the adhesive strip off the green barcode sticker. The paper made a soft, tearing hiss. She pressed the sticker onto the upper edge of the cardboard envelope, her thumb smoothing the paper down until the edges were flat and locked against the cardboard. She took her place in the queue. There were 4 people ahead of her. An elderly woman in a plastic rain bonnet was returning a heavy wool coat. A man in work clothes stood waiting to collect a certified letter, his boots caked with yellow clay. The progress of the line was slow, marked by the heavy, metallic clack-thunk of the clerk's automated date stamp behind the bulletproof glass. Clara waited. Her breathing was slow, her heart rate steady. She watched the dust motes float through the warm, dry air under the fluorescent lights, settling on the old brass mailboxes that line the wall. At 12:12 p.m., the clerk, a weary-looking woman named Mrs. Gable, signaled her forward with a brief nod of her chin. Mrs. Gable's fingers were gray, stained with ink and the fine dust of newsprint. "Certified?" Mrs. Gable asked, her voice flat, her eyes barely lifting to Clara's face. "Yes," Clara said. She slid the priority mail envelope through the gap at the bottom of the glass partition. "And a return receipt, please." Mrs. Gable picked up the envelope. She checked the green barcode, flipped it over to ensure the pink card was properly adhered to the back, and placed it on the digital scale. The red LED display on the scale flickered. 0.4 ounces. $4.40, Mrs. Gable said, her hand already reaching for the sheet of date stamps. Clara reached into her purse, pulled out the single $10 bill, and slid it under the glass. Mrs. Gable took the bill with dry, powdery fingers. She opened her cash drawer, the metal bell inside ringing with a sharp, high-pitched ding. She retrieved a $5 bill, a 50-cent piece, and a single dime, sliding the change back through the slot along with a small, white paper receipt. "Here's your tracking number," Mrs. Gable said. Clara picked up the change. She verified the coins: $5, 50 cents, 10 cents. Added to the two $1 bills remaining in her wallet, her total liquid cash now stood at exactly $7.60. She picked up the small white receipt. She did not place it in her purse where Helen might find it if she searched her bag for grocery money. She folded it into a tight, hard square, smaller than a postage stamp, and tucked it into the tiny fob pocket of her gray trousers. "Thank you," Clara said. Mrs. Gable gave a tired, automated nod, her hands already reaching for the next parcel in the bin behind her. Clara walked out of the post office, stepping back into the wet, freezing slush of the street. The envelope was gone. It was currently sitting in the blue plastic bin behind Mrs. Gable's counter, waiting for the 4 p.m. mail truck. By tonight, it would be in the Central Regional Sorting Facility. By Friday morning, it would be on a truck traveling interstate. And by Monday morning, November 24th, a mail clerk at the bank's corporate headquarters would sign the pink card, sending it back to Cubicle 4. Clara walked back toward the clinic, her head bowed against the wind, her fingers curled tightly around the small, hard square of the receipt in her pocket. The preparation was finished. The legal and financial nets were cast. She had exactly $7.60 to last her until her next paycheck on Friday, November 29th. She would spend her lunches eating stale bread and water, and her family would spend the week freezing in a dark house, but she felt no cold. Inside her chest, the cold calculation was complete, and the machine was finally running on its own momentum. The house was entirely dark when Clara arrived on Friday evening. There were no yellow street lamps reflecting off the wet pavement of the driveway. The entire block was draped in a heavy, cold shadow, but her parents' house felt uniquely hollow. The windows were blank, black squares that seemed to absorb the dim, gray twilight of the November sky. Clara pushed the front door open. The lock did not stick this time. The latch was loose, yielding with a soft, metallic click that echoed too loudly in the quiet hallway. The air inside was freezing, smelling heavily of paraffin wax and the sour, damp scent of unwashed clothes. In the kitchen, a single, short candle sat in the center of the dining table, its yellow flame flickering wildly in the draft. Helen and Julian were sitting opposite each other, their faces carved into sharp, pale angles by the low-hanging light. They did not have plates in front of them. The stove was cold, the digital clock on the microwave dead and black. "Clara," Helen said. Her voice was flat, dry, and entirely stripped of its usual dramatic resonance. She did not stand up. She kept her hands wrapped around a mug of cold water, her eyes fixed on the candle. "The power went out at 3. I called the utility company from the neighbor's house. They said the draft bounced on Monday and they charged us a double reconnection fee." Clara stood at the threshold of the kitchen, her canvas bag resting against her hip. "I know." "No, you don't know," Julian spat, his voice trembling as he leaned into the candle's glow. The yellow light caught the greasy sheen of sweat on his forehead, his hair messy and uncombed. "We went to the bank to deposit the grocery cash to clear the negative balance so they'd let us pay the electric. But they wouldn't take it. The teller said the entire account is frozen. She said there's an administrative hold on any account associated with your Social Security number." He stared at her, his eyes wide, carrying a desperate animal panic. He knew. He had spent the last 24 hours realizing that the $5,000 he had taken was no longer a secret family matter. "They said there's a fraud investigation, Clara. Helen whispered, her voice finally cracking as she looked up. Her eyes were small, wet, and filled with a deep, defensive anger. They said someone reported an unauthorized withdrawal. Why would you do that? Why would you call the bank's fraud division without talking to us first? Clara looked at her mother. She looked at her brother. The yellow flame of the candle danced between them, a tiny, fragile barrier against the dark. She did not feel the urge to explain. She did not feel the need to defend her right to her own labor, her own savings, or her own name. "It was unauthorized," Clara said. "It was for the family," Helen cried, her hand slamming against the lace tablecloth, making the candle wobble in its saucer. "Your brother needed that money to secure our future. You're putting your own family in danger over a banking dispute." The teller said if the investigation continues, they'll involve the sheriff. "Do you want your brother to go to jail, Clara? Is that what you want? To ruin his life because you're bitter?" Clara did not answer. She turned away from the kitchen, her boots clicking softly on the dark linoleum, and walked toward the stairs. "Clara!" Julian yelled, his chair scraping violently against the floor as he stood up. "Don't you walk away from us. You're going to call them tomorrow and cancel it. You're going to tell them it was a mistake. If you don't, I swear to God." "Julian, sit down," Helen's voice cut through the dark, weary and sharp. "Let her go. She'll realize what she's doing when she has to sit in the cold with us." Clara climbed the stairs. She avoided the third step from the top out of habit, though the house was so quiet now that even the softest creak of wood felt like a shout. She reached her bedroom door. She reached out in the dark, her fingers wrapping around the brass doorknob. The knob was loose. It jiggled in her hand, the internal spindle spinning without catching the latch. Clara pulled her smartphone from her pocket and turned on the screen, using the white light to illuminate the lock. The wooden door frame was splintered. Long, pale shards of pine lay on the gray carpet by her feet. Someone had shoved a flathead screwdriver or a heavy butter knife between the door and the frame, prying the latch out of the strike plate until the wood gave way. She pushed the door open. Her bedroom had been systematically searched. Her desk drawers were thrown open, their contents spilled across the floor. Old tax forms, high school notebooks, and empty envelopes scattered like dead leaves. Her small jewelry dish on the dresser was empty. The silver watch their grandfather had given her for her 16th birthday, the one she kept in a velvet box in her top drawer, was gone. They had searched for her checkbook. They had searched for cash. And when they found nothing, they had taken the only item of physical value she owned, likely driving down to the pawn shop on 4th Street before it closed at 6. Clara stood in the center of the ruined room, the white light of her phone screen casting long, sharp shadows across the splintered furniture. Her heart rate remained a steady, calm 65 beats per minute. Her hands did not shake. She knelt beside her bed. She reached deep into the dark corner behind the stack of old winter blankets and pulled out her canvas duffel bag. She unzipped it. The documents were inside. The birth certificate, the title to the sedan, the clinical certificates, and her physical ledger were untouched. They hadn't looked behind the blankets. They had been too hurried, too panicked, focusing only on her desk and her dresser. She zipped the bag shut. The final line had been crossed. The physical boundary of her lock had been shattered, and her grandfather's watch had been sold to pay for their survival. She did not go downstairs to scream. She did not demand the watch back. She stood up, holding the heavy canvas bag by its strap. Tomorrow was Saturday, November 23rd. Her apartment viewing was at 2 p.m. She would go to work, She would take her bag with her, and she would sign the lease. She would never sleep in this room again. The cold inside her bedroom on Saturday morning was sharp, metallic, and completely still. Clara lay on top of her mattress, fully dressed in her gray work trousers, her thickest wool sweater, and her heavy socks. She had not slept under her sheets. Instead, she had spent the night cocooned beneath 3 heavy wool blankets, her canvas duffel bag resting on the floor beside her head, her hand lightly gripping its canvas strap even in her shallow sleep. At 5:15 a.m., her phone buzzed in her hand. It was a single, silent vibration. She sat up. Her joints felt stiff, the cold of the room having settled into her shoulders and knees. She pulled her phone flashlight on, the white beam cutting through the dark to illuminate the splintered wood of her broken door frame. Her movements were slow, quiet, and completely methodical. She picked up her canvas duffel bag. She opened the top zipper, its teeth making a soft metallic hiss in the freezing dark. From her dresser, she retrieved her remaining 3 clinic uniforms, each one folded into a tight, neat rectangle, and slid them inside. She added her toothbrush, her comb, a spare pair of black work shoes, and 2 books of clinical billing codes she had purchased years ago. There was nothing else in the room she wanted. She left the small, white desk she had used since middle school. She left the cheap wooden frame on the wall that held her high school diploma. She left the heavy wool blankets piled on the mattress. She zipped the bag shut. She swung the duffel bag over her right shoulder and carried her gray backpack in her left hand. She stepped through the broken doorway, her boots making no sound on the carpet. The hallway was pitch black, smelling of damp wool and the chemical scent of the single paraffin candle that had burned down to a greasy gray smear in the kitchen below. Clara walked down the stairs, avoiding the 3rd step from the top out of habit, her body moving with a practiced, automatic grace. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, she stopped. The living room was illuminated by the faint blue-gray light of the dawn filtering through the frosted windows. Helen was sitting on the sofa, wrapped in a heavy green wool blanket that was pulled up to her chin. Her face was pale, her eyes bloodshot and swollen from a night without sleep or warmth. She was staring blankly at the cold black radiator in the corner. On the sideboard beside the front door sat the small blue ceramic dish where the car keys were kept. Clara walked over to it. She reached out, her fingers wrapping around the cold metal ring. The keys clicked softly against the ceramic. Helen's head turned slowly, the green wool blanket rustling against her sweater. Her eyes fixed on the duffel bag slung over Clara's shoulder, then moved to the keys in Clara's hand. "Where are you going with those bags?" Helen's voice was dry, a raspy whisper that carried no anger, only a deep, exhausted confusion. "I have the Saturday morning shift," Clara said. Her voice was level, her face completely empty of emotion. "And the duffel?" Helen's eyes narrowed, her hand tightening on the edge of the blanket. "Since when do you take a duffel bag to the clinic, Clara?" "I'm dropping some donation things in the bin behind the grocery store," Clara said. She did not blink. She did not look away. The lie was simple, factual, and delivered with the same clinical indifference she used when processing an insurance rejection. Helen looked at the keys. "You can't take the car. Julian has that follow-up call with the logistics firm today. He needs to go to the pharmacy for your father." "He'll have to walk," Clara said. Helen flinched, her mouth opening slightly as if she were about to scream, but the cold of the house seemed to choke the words in her throat. She looked at Clara, truly looked at her, and for the first time, a faint, terrified realization flickered in her eyes. She saw the heavy duffel bag. She saw the car keys. She saw the absolute, unbroken silence of her daughter's face. She realized that the lock on Clara's door was splintered, and that the silver watch was gone, and that there was no safety net left in this house. "Clara," Helen whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, don't do this. Your father, his chest is so tight." Clara did not answer. She turned away from her mother, her fingers tightening around the cold brass of the front door handle. She pulled it open, stepped out into the freezing gray mist of the Saturday morning, and closed the door behind her. The latch clicked shut into the frame with a solid, final snap. The air outside was biting, the temperature hovering just below 32 degrees. The front yard was covered in a thick white sheet of frost that crunched loudly beneath her boots as she walked down the driveway. The sedan was sitting by the curb, its windshield covered in a hard, opaque layer of ice. Clara threw her duffel bag and her backpack into the passenger seat, closed the door, and inserted the key into the ignition. She turned it. The old starter motor groaned once, twice, a slow, heavy struggle in the freezing air, before the engine caught with a sudden, rattling roar. The old fan belt squealed for 3 seconds before settling into a low, metallic idle. Clara got out of the car, retrieved her plastic ice scraper from the trunk, and began to clear the windshield. Shh, shh, shh. The hard, white ice fell away in large, clean sheets, revealing the dark glass beneath. Her fingers turned red under her thin wool gloves, the cold biting through the fabric, but she did not stop. She scraped the driver's side window, the passenger side window, and the rear glass with a steady, rhythmic pressure. She got back in the car. She adjusted her rear-view mirror. Through the rear glass, she could see the front of her parents' house, a dark, dead shape of gray siding and black windows fading slowly into the thick November fog. She put the car in drive. She pulled away from the curb, her tires crunching over the frozen leaves, leaving the house, the cold kitchen, and her family's panic behind her in the silent gray morning. The leasing office of the Oak Street Apartments was located on the ground floor of a 3-story brick building, smelling of commercial carpet cleaner, fresh paint, and the faint, sweet scent of a plug-in vanilla air freshener. It was 2:10 p.m. on Saturday. Clara stood in the center of Unit 3B. The studio apartment was exactly 410 square feet. A single rectangular room with a small kitchenette along one wall and a narrow bathroom behind a hollow core door. The walls were painted a clean, clinical semi-gloss white, and the floor was covered in pale gray vinyl planking that reflected the gray light coming through the double-hung window. Greg, the property manager, stood by the doorway, his hands tucked into his pockets, his leather dress shoes clicking slightly as he shifted his weight. "It's small," Greg said, his voice carrying a light, professional shrug. "But the heating is electric baseboard. You control your own thermostat. The water pressure is good. I replaced the shower head yesterday." Clara walked to the wall thermostat, a small, white plastic dial. She turned it to 70 degrees. Click. She stood by the metal baseboard heater beneath the window. Within 2 minutes, a faint, dry smell of heated dust rose from the metal fins, followed by a steady, invisible wave of warmth that immediately began to clear the chill from her fingers. She walked to the kitchen sink. She turned the faucet. The water came out hot, steam rising from the stainless steel basin, smelling of nothing but clean copper. "I'll take it," Clara said. "Excellent," Greg said, pulling a clipboard from under his arm. "I have the standard 12-month lease ready. Since you brought the certified cashier's check for $1,000, we can sign the documents right now, and I can hand over the keys today." Your December rent is covered, and the remaining $150 will be applied to your security deposit. You can pay the balance of the deposit on the 1st. Clara took his black ballpoint pen. She placed the clipboard on the kitchen counter. Her physical routine was unchanged. She signed her name on the bottom of the lease agreement with a clean, unhurried stroke. The signature was identical to the one on her clinical ID badge, identical to her payroll authorizations, and identical to the affidavit of forgery she had mailed on Thursday. She handed him the clipboard and the white envelope containing her cashier's check. Greg verified the signatures, stamped the landlord's portion with a red ink seal, and retrieved a small brass ring holding 2 bright, clean keys. He slid them across the counter to her. "Welcome to the building, Ms. Vance," Greg said. "Let me know if you need anything else." "Thank you, Greg," Clara said. She stood in the center of the room, listening to Greg's heavy, rhythmic footsteps fade down the carpeted hallway until the heavy fire door at the end of the corridor clicked shut. The silence inside the studio was absolute. She set her canvas duffel bag and her gray backpack on the clean vinyl floor. She sat down on the duffel bag, her back resting against the warm, white wall beneath the window. The baseboard heater continued to hum softly, wrapping her legs in a dry, comfortable heat. She pulled her phone from her pocket. The screen was dark, but as soon as she swiped to unlock it, the interface loaded a long, continuous column of notifications. There were 7 missed calls from Helen, 3 missed calls from an unknown local number, and a series of 9 text messages from Julian. She opened the messages. "Julian, 1:15 p.m. Clara, where the hell are you? The bank called Mom. They said they have security footage of the branch withdrawal. They said they're sending an officer to the house." "Julian, 1:40 p.m. Clara, call them off. You have to call the bank right now and tell them it was a mistake. Tell them I had your permission. They're threatening to file charges." "Julian, 2:02 p.m. Clara, please. The police are here. They have a warrant or something. They're in the driveway. Mom is hysterical. Dad is having trouble breathing. You did this. You psychotic You're ruining my life over a stupid bank account." "Julian, 2:15 p.m. They're taking me in. Grand larceny and forgery. They showed me the printout of my face from the camera." "Clara, tell them you gave me the ID. Please, Clara. Mom is going with me to the station. Dad is on the floor. They called an ambulance." Clara read the text slowly, her eyes moving from line to line with a calm, clinical focus. She could picture the scene at the house, the blue and red emergency lights reflecting off the frosted windows of the neighborhood. The police car parked behind the silent, empty sedan. No, she had the sedan. The police car parked in the driveway, its tires crushing the frozen yellow leaves. Julian being led down the steps in his sweatpants, his wrists cold in the metal cuffs, his face bloated with panic. Helen screaming from the porch, her green wool blanket falling into the mud. And Thomas in his recliner, his chest still, his swollen ankles cold as the paramedics wheeled the gurney through the front door. They had crossed every line. They had taken her money, broken her lock, sold her grandfather's watch, and demanded her survival as their natural right. And now, the machine of their own choices had ground them to dust. Clara exited the messaging application. She opened her banking app. She checked her Apex Digital account balance. Available balance, $120. She had exactly $120 left in her account and $7.60 in cash in her pocket. It was a thin margin, but she was warm. She was safe. Her December rent was paid, her new keys were in her palm, and her direct deposit would hit next Friday. She looked up at the clean white ceiling of her studio. The sun was beginning to set outside, casting a long golden shaft of light across the gray floorboards. Her phone began to vibrate in her hand. The screen displayed her mother's name. Clara did not swipe to answer. She did not decline the call. She set the phone face down on the vinyl floor, letting it buzz silently against the gray planks, the vibrations fading into the quiet, warm room as she leaned her head back against the wall and finally closed her eyes. The morning sun rose over Oak Street at 7 a.m., casting a long, pale sheet of yellow light across the gray vinyl floorboards of Unit 3B. Clara sat on the floor, her back resting against the warm drywall beneath the window. The studio was perfectly quiet, save for the low, rhythmic hum of the small refrigerator in the kitchen corner and the occasional, soft click hiss of the electric baseboard heater as it maintained the room at exactly 70 degrees. On the laminate counter sat her only new purchases, made at the convenience store down the street the night before. A single white ceramic mug that had cost $1.50, a cheap metal spoon, a small carton of milk, and a loaf of pre-sliced wheat bread. She had filled her thrift shop electric kettle with tap water. She watched it now, her eyes fixed on the tiny indicator light that glowed a soft, steady red. Click, the light went out. A thin, silent plume of white steam rose from the kettle's plastic spout, smelling of nothing but clean, hot water. There was no trace of rust, no scent of camphor, and no sound of heavy, rattling breathing coming through the floorboards. She poured the water over her tea bag, watching the dark amber liquid swirl and rise to the brim of the white mug. She added a splash of milk, stirred it once with the metal spoon, and took a slow, deliberate sip. The warmth settled in her chest, clean and undisturbed. At 8:15 a.m., her phone on the floor began to vibrate, its dull buzz echoing against the hollow vinyl planks. The screen illuminated. The caller ID did not display her mother's name or Julian's. It read, County General Hospital, Main Admissions. Clara picked up the phone. She swiped the screen. Clara Vance? Hello, Miss Vance, a woman's voice said. The voice was polite, carrying the practiced flat weariness of an institutional worker. My name is Evelyn. I'm a patient liaison in the Emergency Billing and Social Work Department here at County General. I'm calling regarding your father, Thomas Vance. Yes, Clara said. Mr. Vance was admitted to our cardiac care unit yesterday afternoon under critical status, Evelyn said, her keyboard clicking softly over the line. He is currently stabilized, but we are looking at his discharge planning and verifying his financial and insurance information. The primary contact number on his Medicare file is disconnected, and we've been trying to reach your mother, Helen Vance. The police liaison here noted that her last known location was the county booking facility, and she hasn't returned our calls. Clara took another sip of her tea. I see. Ms. Vance, as the next of kin listed on his secondary registry, we need someone to come in and sign the financial guarantor forms for his inpatient deductible and to authorize the coordination of his home medical equipment. He's going to require a portable oxygen concentrator upon discharge, and the copay for the lease is $380. The line was quiet for several seconds, the only sound being the distant tinny page for a physician over the hospital's intercom system. Evelyn waited, expecting the usual response, the gasp of panic, the frantic questions about the patient's condition, the tearful promises to find the money. Clara's pulse remained a steady, calm 64 beats per minute. She calculated the legal structure of the request. At the private clinic where she worked, she had always paid in cash or used her personal debit card directly, keeping her name off the billing registry as a cosigner. But here, at County General, if she walked into the admissions office and signed the guarantor forms, she would be legally binding her own credit and her own salary to the thousands of dollars in hospital bills that Thomas's basic Medicare did not cover. She would be stepping back into the harness. She would be allowing them to pull her back into the dark house. "I am not my father's medical proxy," Clara said, her voice smooth, level, and entirely devoid of emotion. "And I am not his financial guarantor. You will need to obtain those signatures from my mother, Helen Vance, once she is available." A long silence followed her statement. Over the line, Clara could hear Evelyn's breathing shift, a sudden cold stiffness entering the liaison's tone. "Ms. Vance," Evelyn said, her voice dropping into a sharp administrative register. "Your father is 72 years old. His cardiac output is extremely low, and he cannot be safely discharged without this equipment. If your mother is unavailable or unable to pay, the hospital will have to initiate a ward of the state evaluation or transfer him to a county-managed nursing facility. Do you understand the consequences of declining to sign?" "I understand," Clara said. "And you are formally refusing to act as his financial coordinator?" "I am," Clara said. "Very well," Evelyn said, her typing resuming, the keys hitting the board with a sharp, angry rhythm. "I will document your refusal in the social work file. We will proceed with contacting your mother through the county sheriff's liaison. Thank you for your time." "Thank you, Evelyn," Clara said. She hung up the phone. She set the device face down on the gray floorboards. She picked up her white mug, holding it in both hands, feeling the heat penetrate her palms. She looked out the window. The sky was a pale, clear blue today, the cold mist of the week having finally cleared, leaving the streets of Oak Street clean and quiet under the winter sun. She did not feel a single tremor of guilt. She did not feel the cold weight of regret. Thomas's collapse was the physical result of Helen's choices, and Helen's choices were the direct result of Julian's greed. They had built their own structure, brick by brick, out of lies, theft, and favoritism, and she had simply stepped out of the way before the roof fell in. She took another sip of her tea. It was warm, sweet, and entirely her own. The administrative wing of the St. Jude outpatient clinic was quiet on Monday morning, the low-frequency hum of the server room down the hall providing a steady, white noise backdrop to the clicking of keyboards. Clara sat in cubicle 4, her fingers typing with a rhythmic, unhurried cadence. ICD-10, code I50.9, heart failure, unspecified. She entered the string, her face bathed in the cool, blue-white light of her monitor. Beside her keyboard sat her mail bin. At the very top of the small stack of paper lay a pink card, the domestic return receipt from Capital One. It had been signed in blue ink by an officer in the bank's corporate fraud division in Wilmington, Delaware, on Friday afternoon. The physical proof of receipt had arrived exactly where she had directed it. "Clara?" Sarah stood at the entrance of her cubicle, her expression a mix of curiosity and mild apprehension. Behind her stood a tall man in a dark charcoal overcoat. He carried a leather notebook in his hand, his eyes scanning the office with a quiet, observant focus. "There's a Detective Miller here to see you," Sarah whispered, leaning in. "He said it's regarding a personal matter." Clara did not flinch. Her hands dropped to her lap, her pulse remaining a calm, steady 66 beats per minute. "Thank you, Sarah." Detective Miller stepped into the cubicle as Sarah retreated. He pulled a small, brass-backed chair from the corner, sat down, and placed his leather notebook on the edge of her desk. "Ms. Vance," he said, his voice low, measured, and entirely professional. "I'm with the County White Collar and Property Crimes Division. I'm here regarding the affidavit of forgery you filed with Capital One last week." "Yes," Clara said. "We received the bank's evidence packet this morning, including the branch security footage from October 24th, the detective said, opening his notebook. "The identification of the suspect was confirmed as your brother, Julian Vance. He was booked on charges of grand larceny and forgery on Saturday afternoon." He reached into his deep overcoat pocket. When his hand emerged, he laid a small, clear plastic evidence bag on the desk between them. Inside the plastic, resting on a bed of blue cardboard, was a silver watch with a slightly worn brown leather strap. The silver casing reflected the fluorescent lights overhead, its face clean, the second hand ticking with a steady, silent sweep. "Your brother attempted to pawn this watch at the 4th Street Gold and Loan on Friday afternoon," Detective Miller said, pointing a finger at the bag. "Under county law, pawn shops are required to run every customer's identification through a real-time database synced with local law enforcement. Because you had officially flagged your name and social security number for identity theft on Thursday morning, the database flagged the transaction the moment he presented your expired ID to the broker. The manager triggered the silent alarm, and we picked him up at the counter." Clara looked at the watch. It was her grandfather's watch. Julian had broken her lock, ransacked her desk, and walked straight into the digital net she had woven just 24 hours prior. By trying to sell her property using her stolen identity, he had provided the police with the physical evidence needed to lock the case. She did not cry. She did not feel a sudden rush of vindictive joy. She simply felt the satisfying, cold weight of a mathematically perfect resolution. "We will need you to sign for the recovery of the stolen property once the court proceedings conclude," the detective said, standing up and sliding his notebook back into his coat. "But for now, the case is fully locked. Your brother's arraignment is tomorrow morning." "Thank you, Detective," Clara said. She watched him walk down the administrative corridor, his heavy coat rustling against the partition walls, until the fire door clicked shut behind him. Clara picked up her black gel pen. She opened her desk drawer, placed the pink Capital One return receipt inside her bag, and closed the drawer. The machine of her family's choices had run its course. Julian was in a county cell, facing felony charges. Helen was left alone in a freezing, dark house, forced to navigate the hospital billing departments and the county jail without a buffer. And Clara was sitting in a warm clinic, her new apartment keys in her pocket, her grandfather's watch secured, and her absolute, silent freedom locked behind an unbreakable boundary. She looked back at her monitor, her fingers returning to the keys, her mind entirely at peace as she typed the next billing code into the system. The screen slowly fades to black as the clinical hum of the outpatient lobby drifts into a profound, heavy silence. The camera lingers on the cold, empty spaces of the old house, now dark, before returning to the warm, bright simplicity of Clara's new studio window. If you were gripped by Clara's quiet resilience and the meticulous, slow burn unfolding of this family drama, we invite you to subscribe to the channel. By turning on notifications, you ensure you never miss our next deep dive into the complex, silent battles of human nature. Your support allows us to continue crafting these high-quality, emotionally devastating stories of survival and boundary setting. Thank you for listening, and until next time, remember to protect your quiet spaces.